The Dark Lords of the Sith were, without a doubt, the greatest threats the galaxy ever faced. Their shadowy legacy stretched back thousands of years. Many fearsome Dark Lords rose and fell over the centuries, spreading death and despair across known space. But how did this legacy begin? Who was the first Dark Lord of the Sith? In this video, we'll be answering that question and taking a look at the birth of the first Sith Empire. Followers of the dark side predated the Sith by tens of thousands of years, regularly clashing with their counterparts on the light side. During the early ages of the Republic, the Jedi Order usually quashed these dark side threats before they could attain significant power. Sometimes, however, these threats came from inside the Jedi Order itself, leading to schisms. The First Great Schism, a war between the Jedi Order and the Dark Jedi of the Legions of Leto, was an early example of this. The First Great Schism ended fairly quickly, with the Jedi emerging victorious, but it set a nasty precedent, inspiring many future Dark Jedi. In 7000 BBY, there was a Second Great Schism. Yet again, a sect of Jedi embraced the dark side and broke off from the Order. But these Dark Jedi were different from those who had come before. Unlike the Legions of Leto, they were committed to the dark side's utmost extremes, and they developed alchemical techniques that allowed them to infuse objects and beings with the dark side. In time, their alchemical practices developed into techniques for creating, shaping, and corrupting life, breeding abominations of nature they called Leviathans. When the Jedi Order learned of this, they agreed that these schismatics were a threat to life itself, and again, they went to war. Unlike the First Great Schism, the war with these new Dark Jedi was not won so easily. In fact, the Dark Jedi held out for a full century. This terrible war between light and dark, called the 100-Year Darkness, was hard fought by both sides, but in the end, the Jedi had the advantage. The war ended with the Battle of Corbos, in which all but a dozen of the Dark Jedi were slain. The Republic wanted the Jedi to execute the survivors, but the Jedi resolved to exile them instead. Hoping the Dark Jedi would find redemption on some deserted rimworld, the Jedi marched their defeated foes aboard a galleon and shot it into the unknown. It's possible that they never made a worse mistake. These exiles were among the greatest of the Dark Jedi. Among their number were Sauzas Sin, their most gifted alchemist, Karnus Mor, a vicious warlord, Baron Draper, the admiral of their last fleet, and Zozan, the marchioness of the Black Legions. Their leader was High General Ajunta Pall, the greatest of the schismatic Dark Jedi, who had single-handedly slain a dozen Jedi in one encounter during the Battle of Corbos. Under Ajunta Pall's direction, Sauzas Sin steered the exiles' galleon toward a powerful force signature, the world that screamed the loudest to those who hear the dark side's call. They landed on Korriban. On Korriban, the exiles discovered a species of red-skinned force sensitives called the Sith, who had built a civilization on the use of the dark side. The natives were initially suspicious of the exiles, but Ajunta Pall eventually cowed them with a fearsome display of force power. The Sith, thinking that Pall was a manifestation of one of their gods, took the exiles to Ziost, their species' adopted homeworld. There, they met with Hackagram Grouch, then the foremost Sith King, and demanded he bow before them. Grouch resisted and attacked Ajunta Pall, but he was quickly defeated. Pall executed Grouch with his own sword and declared himself the Dark Lord of the Sith. This brutal display of strength allowed the exiles to subjugate the Sith purebloods and become the very first Sith Lords. Each of them laid claim to one of the scattering worlds the Sith had colonized, together forming the Sith Empire. Ajunta Pall, the Dark Lord, ruled over all from Ziost, and Sauzas Sin served as his shadow hand or deputy. The other 10 Sith Lords formed the Council. Each of them managed a part of the Empire, but they would meet regularly to rule the Empire as a whole. In the unknown space beyond the borders of the Republic, the Sith Lords expanded their new empire, forming armies, building strongholds, and breeding new monsters, which were now called Sith Spawn. They adopted many of the traditions of the Sith and abandoned many Jedi traditions they had continued to cling to. Most notably, they stopped using lightsabers, opting instead to wield alchemically enhanced swords, as most Sith purebloods did. The Sith, however, retained the knowledge of lightsaber technology, but use of the weapon rose and fell over the course of the Empire's history. In the years after their conquest of the Sith, Ajunta Pall and his followers became acquainted with many of the Sith worlds. On Ziost, their adopted homeworld, they built the towering Sith Citadel, a massive fortress city from which they ruled their empire. They also established Sith holdings on Korriban, the original homeworld of the Sith Purebloods, which the Purebloods had used as a graveyard. They investigated the many tombs and caverns of Korriban, unearthing many of the planet's long-forgotten secrets. The Sith Lords discovered one particular valley on Korriban that was especially steeped in the dark side, and in the caverns below it, they found the greatest secret of all, a Rakatan star map. This ancient dark side artifact was the source of the shadow that lay over the valley, and they discovered that they could draw on it to enhance their power. The Sith Lords laid claim to the valley, which was later named the Valley of the Dark Lords, and built a great fortress there, which they intended to use as a redoubt in case the Jedi ever discovered them and attacked. Ajunta Pall spent his reign as a Dark Lord consolidating his power and building up the Sith Empire. Some of the other Sith Lords, hungry for revenge on the Jedi, took a Sith fleet to attack the Republic prematurely, but the others were mostly content to hold back and build up their armies instead. They were more focused on increasing their individual powers and furthering the art of Sith alchemy, creating ever greater abominations in the breeding pits of Ziost. During his time in power, Ajunta Pall, like many of the other Sith Lords, forged an alchemically enhanced sword for himself. This double-bladed weapon was forged of black steel and was always cold to the touch. Shadows rippled along the edge of the blade, giving it a particularly sinister appearance. Ajunta Pall poured much of his power into this sword, and with it slew a great many enemies. So terrible was this sword that its legend lasted for thousands of years, with the Sith Purebloods considering it a sacred artifact. A rhyme was often used to symbolize the weapon in Sith writings. I am that which grips the heart in fright, hearkens the night and silences the light. Ajunta Pall ruled for decades, but as with all Dark Lords, his reign eventually came to an end. He was killed in battle, but not by a Jedi and not by any other foe of the Sith Empire. Pall's spectre later recounted how he and the rest of the Sith Lords met their ends.
What choice have I? I betrayed my old masters. They would never let me return to the light side. It is too late, too late. Here is where I rest. Here is where my eternity awaits. If I could return, oh my master, it has been so long, and I regret so much.
The first Sith Lords met the same fates as many of their successors. They envied each other, schemed against one another, and in the end, they destroyed each other. Battle broke out in the fortress on Korriban, which was destabilized by the fighting and collapsed. Ajunta Pall and his contemporaries were all killed. The Sith Empire that Pall and his followers created endured long after their deaths. New Sith Lords arose from among the Sith Purebloods, and a second Dark Lord was chosen. The fortress in the Valley of Dark Lords was never rebuilt. Instead, the Sith used the caverns of the valley to bury their fallen Dark Lords. Ajunta Pall was laid to rest in the first of the valley's tombs, buried with his sword and those of his slain rivals. His successors remembered him as one of the most powerful Sith to ever live, and went on to terrorize the galaxy for thousands of years in his name. But the story of Ajunta Pall doesn't end with his death. Pall's spirit remained trapped in the world of the living, tied to his sword. He lingered in the tomb on Korriban for thousands of years, alone and impotent. In time, a strange thing happened. He began to feel remorse for what he had done. Even as the Sith thrived and spread across the galaxy, their founder came to regret falling to the dark side in the first place. Pall's torment only ended when the redeemed Revan arrived 3,000 years after his death, seeking the Dark Lord's sword. The spectre of Ajunta Pall appeared to Revan, requesting that he take the sword and leave. Revan did so, but before parting with the Dark Lord's spirit, he suggested the possibility of redemption. Pall, at first, didn't believe he could be redeemed, but at Revan's urging, he abandoned the dark side and surrendered himself to the will of the Force. Finally at peace, the spirit of Ajunta Pall returned to the light and merged with the Force, freed from his torment at last. When Star Wars fans think of Sith Lords, we usually think of black-robed figures with red lightsabers, imposing beings that exuded pure evil. We think of Darth Vader and Darth Sidious, or perhaps some of the more ancient Sith like Darth Revan and Darth Vitiate. But what if we were to tell you that you've been sleeping on one of the most powerful Sith Lords of all time? Exar Kun may not have looked much like a stereotypical Sith. He didn't even carry a red lightsaber, like he was some normie Jedi or something. But don't let that deceive you. Exar Kun nearly destroyed both the Republic and the Jedi Order. The Jedi homeworld burned on his command, and the Supreme Chancellor himself died at his hand. This man was one of the most powerful figures in galactic history, and in this video, we'll be telling his story. Exar Kun, because of you, the Sith will never die. You have earned the right to bear the mark of the Dark Lord of the Sith. So spoke the spectre of Marka Ragnos in a vision shared by Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma. Just moments before, those two fallen Jedi had been enemies, engaged in a fearsome lightsaber duel. But by the time the vision cleared, they had become allies. Kun was the new Dark Lord of the Sith, and Ulic would be his apprentice. Together, they swore to bring down the Republic, the Jedi Order, and all others who stood in their way. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Our story didn't begin there. Instead, it began on remote Dantooine 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Long ago, there was a small Jedi enclave on that world, home to many masters, including the renowned Vodo Siosk Bas. In 4000 BBY, Bas was busy training a trio of apprentices, the Cathar mates Credo and Silvar, and the human Exar Kun. All three were gifted Jedi with an aptitude for lightsaber combat and a fierce hunger for knowledge. Some would say their desire to learn was too fierce, especially for Exar Kun, who frequently borrowed his master's collection of holocrons to learn about the Dark Lords of the Sith. In those days, the Jedi Order still knew little about the Sith. The last Sith Lord they knew was Freedon Nad, who had conquered Onderon 4 centuries prior. But by 4000 BBY, Nad was long dead, and the dark side hadn't reared its ugly head since his passing. Exar Kun felt that the Sith were going to return, however, and he didn't believe the Jedi were prepared for that eventuality. He hated the Sith, and whenever he could, he attempted to learn their secrets to discover how best to stop them. For this, he was often rebuked by Master Bas, who repeatedly cautioned him that such curiosity could lead him to embrace the dark side himself. He was prone to overlook his apprentice's curiosity, however, as Kun was a very promising student. He was extremely strong in the Force, and his skills with the lightsaber were almost unmatched. In one training duel, Kun was even able to best his master through the use of Jar Kai techniques, bringing 2 lightsabers to bear against Bas's combat staff. It was shortly after this incident that Exar Kun decided to leave Dantooine behind. Believing he had learned all that Master Bas had to teach, Kun set out from Onderon, where he wished to research Freedon Nad and the Sith. His search led him to Duxon, Onderon's demon moon, where Nad's remains had been sealed in a tomb by the Jedi. He came looking for artifacts to examine, but he got much more than he had bargained for, as he ended up encountering the spectre of the Sith Lord himself. When the proud Exar Kun declared his intentions to destroy the Sith to the Spectre, Nad offered to guide him to their homeworld, promising to teach him the secrets of the Sith. Nad guided Kun to the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban, where the Dark Lords of the Sith had their tombs. Nad lured the young Jedi into one of the tombs, but this was a trap. The Sith Spectre brought the tomb down on Exar Kun, shattering his bones and burying him beneath a pile of debris. As Kun lay dying, Nad told him that the only way he could survive was through the use of the dark side. Initially, Kun tried to resist this temptation, but the influence of Nad and the dark taint of Korriban proved too strong. He gave in to the dark side, drawing in the Sith power that lay heavy over the tomb. His wounds were healed, and when he rose, he found that he suddenly understood the Sith hieroglyphs on the walls of the tomb. At first, Kun denied that he had fallen to the dark side, but he still complied when Nad suggested that he travel next to Yavin 4, where Naga Sadow, the last Dark Lord of the Sith Empire, had hidden long ago. On Yavin, Kun encountered the Massassi, members of the Sith warrior caste that had accompanied Sadow to the moon. The Massassi captured Kun and brought him to one of their temples where they planned to sacrifice him to a massive Sith rim. As Exar Kun faced certain death, the voice of Freedom Nad spoke to him once more, urging him to call upon the power of the dark side. At last, Kun gave in. Using an ancient Sith gauntlet to amplify his fury, Kun killed the Sith rim, slaughtered many of the Massassi, and in a rage, destroyed the spirit of Freedom Nad as well. The surviving Massassi bowed before him, and Kun declared himself a Sith Lord. Exar Kun remained on Yavin 4 for a time, studying the artifacts and temples the Massassi had guarded. He learned a great many dark side techniques, including ancient Sith alchemy powers. As his dark power grew, Kun became the creator of many new breeds of Sith spawn, including enhanced Massassi berserkers and the terrifying Tarantatech. Soon, he had learned all that there was to learn from Sadow's Horde, and set off once more, leaving the Massassi to build new temples in his honor. As he returned to the Republic, Kun learned of Ulic Qel-Droma, another fallen Jedi who had joined a Sith cult called the Krath. Believing the Krath to be rivals to his power, Kun traveled to the Empress Teta system to kill Qel-Droma. The two began a fierce lightsaber duel, but during the battle, Kun's Sith gauntlet synchronized with an amulet worn by Qel-Droma, conjuring up a vision of the Sith Lords of old. In the vision, the Dark Lord Marka Ragnos declared that Kun and Qel-Droma were the future of the Sith, the new Dark Lords. They would put an end to the Sith's long age of dormancy, and because of them, the Sith legacy would endure forever. Kun and Qel-Droma were branded on the forehead with ancient Sith markings, and when the vision faded, they joined forces. Intending to make war with the Republic, Qel-Droma set off to recruit the Mandalorians while Kun traveled to Ossus, the Jedi homeworld. There, he murdered Jedi Master Odin in secret and seduced a number of young apprentices with promises of power. He brought a few dozen of them to Yavin 4, where, with the help of Sith spirits, he turned them to the dark side. He then sent the Jedi back to Ossus, where they would wait until he gave the signal. Around this time, Qel-Droma, his Krath armies, and his Mandalorian allies had begun their assault on the Republic. Fleets of Krath stormed across Republic space, terrorizing the galaxy, while the Mandalorian Crusaders carved their way across dozens of worlds. But as Kun prepared to join the fight with his Massassi followers, he received news that Qel-Droma had been captured in a failed assault on Coruscant and was to be put on trial before the Senate. In Exar Kun's position, most Sith would have either left Qel-Droma to die or launched their own assault on Coruscant. But Exar Kun was not most Sith. Instead, he took Mandalore the Indomitable and a few Massassi to Coruscant and strolled right through the front doors of the Senate building like an absolute Chad. With a thought, he telekinetically paralyzed everyone in the room and then leaped up onto the Chancellor's podium. Digging his fingers into the back of the Chancellor's skull, Kun used him as a puppet, forcing him to echo a fiery speech that, thanks to the televised nature of the trial, was broadcast to the entire galaxy. To quote the man himself, "The Sith Empire will rise again, and we are the spark. The flames will wash over the crumbling Republic and consume all your works, re-establishing the glorious days of a lost golden age, far greater than any of us can know. You can choose either to be a part of this great rebirth, or you can stand in our way. We did all this to show how useless and ineffective the Republic is. We don't want your cooperation. The Republic is not even part of the plan." Following this, Kun killed the Chancellor, and he and Qel-Droma went to leave the Senate the same way they came in, dragging their massive balls behind them. They found their path blocked, however, by Vodo Siosk Bas. Kun's old master tried one last time to redeem his former apprentice, but Kun rebuffed the offer and attacked. A ferocious rematch of their duel on Dantooine began, and at first, it seemed the two were evenly matched. But then Kun revealed some modifications that he had made to his lightsaber. He had added a second blade to it. Wielding history's first double-bladed lightsaber, Kun butchered his former master and then left Coruscant with his allies. As a quick side note, Exar Kun wasn't just the first being to use a saber staff in universe. His use of a double blade in the Tales of the Jedi comics actually predated the first appearance of Darth Maul by 2 years as well. After leaving Coruscant, Exar Kun issued a command to the fallen Jedi he had recruited. All over the galaxy, they rose up and murdered their masters, from Ossus to Dantooine, throwing the Jedi Order into chaos. Hundreds of Jedi died in a single day, crippling the Republic military. With both the Republic and the Jedi Order close to the breaking point, Kun and his followers pressed their offensive. On Kun's orders, Krath leader Alima Keto caused the 10 stars of the Kron cluster to supernova, creating a massive explosion that cleansed Ossus of life. The destruction of the Jedi homeworld was Exar Kun's greatest victory, but it was also his last victory. Following the razing of Ossus, the Republic Navy began a counterattack against Sith forces, wiping out their fleets one by one. Ulic Qel-Droma repented and returned to the Jedi, and most of Kun's Dark Jedi followers were killed. Kun was left only with his Massassi, who he recalled to Yavin 4. With Republic forces in hot pursuit, Kun began an alchemical ritual intended to make him immortal, forcing the Massassi to sacrifice themselves en masse to feed his power. The ritual sent out a shockwave that scorched the entire moon, leaving none of the Massassi alive. By the time the Republic arrived at Yavin, the moon was devoid of life, and Kun was nowhere to be found. He was presumed dead. However, unbeknownst to the Jedi, the ritual had indeed made the spirit of Exar Kun immortal. He persisted in the Great Temple on Yavin 4 for millennia, outlasting even Darth Sidious himself, until he was ultimately vanquished by Luke Skywalker. Exar Kun's lasting legacy was not in his spirit's survival, however, but rather the effect he had over the course of galactic history. Only a handful of Sith Lords ever came as close to he had to destroying the Republic and vanquishing the Jedi, and only one would ever surpass him. Furthermore, he completely transformed the Sith as an order. All Sith Orders after him would consist primarily of fallen Jedi, something that allowed the Sith to persist for millennia. In a recent video, we told the story of Marka Ragnos, one of the last great Dark Lords of the First Sith Empire. We spoke of how Ragnos ruled with an iron fist, crushing all who opposed him and bringing about the golden age of the Sith. But 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, Marka Ragnos died, creating a huge power vacuum. Two Sith Lords sought to take Ragnos' place, Naga Sadow and Ludo Kressh. Both ended up proclaiming themselves Dark Lord of the Sith, but both of their reigns were short. In this video, we'll be telling the story of these two fierce rivals and how they brought down the Sith Empire. Let's revisit the reign of Marka Ragnos for a moment. From 5100 to 5000 BBY, Marka Ragnos ruled the Sith Empire with an iron fist, putting an end to centuries of Sith infighting caused by stagnation. The Sith Empire had long run out of systems to conquer, but Ragnos was able to maintain stability through political manipulation. By the end of his reign, the Empire was prosperous, ruled by a council of some of the greatest Sith Lords seen in centuries. Aside from Marka Ragnos himself, other powerful Sith Lords of the day included Simus, a disembodied head in a jar kept alive through darkside power, Naga Sadow, a powerful sorcerer directly descended from the original Sith Lords, and Ludo Kressh, a staunch traditionalist. After Ragnos' death in 5000 BBY, the Sith Empire stood at a crossroads. One faction of the Sith Lords, led by Ludo Kressh, sought to maintain what Ragnos had built and were wary of change within the Empire. But another faction, led by the ambitious Naga Sadow, wanted the Sith Empire to start expanding again. Sadow and Kresh's differing views sparked a bitter rivalry, one that only worsened when Ragnos died. Without question, the two were the most powerful Sith in the Empire, but it was anyone's guess which of them would ultimately become the Dark Lord. The struggle between Kressh and Sadow began before Ragnos' body was even laid to rest. On the day of the Dark Lord's funeral, Sadow was delayed on his way to Korriban, and so Kressh began the funeral without him, leading the procession to Ragnos' tomb in the Valley of the Dark Lords. Sadow arrived in the middle of the funeral, and the peace between him and Kressh barely lasted long enough for the ceremony to be completed. Just a few moments after the tomb door was sealed, Sadow and Kressh drew their swords and fought a bitter battle for the title of Dark Lord. Their duel, however, was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Marka Ragnos' spectre. The dead Dark Lord warned his would-be successors that a crucial moment was at hand for the Sith, and that the Empire would have to be careful and choose its battles well if it were to survive. He reminded the assembled Sith of their history, of the conquest of the Sith Empire of old, and then faded with the final warning. Both Sadow and Kressh interpreted Ragnos' warning to be an endorsement of their plan, naturally. They would have soon begun fighting again were it not for the unexpected arrival of a starship in Korriban's ashen skies, a vessel from the Galactic Republic. The ship was Starbreaker 12, and aboard were a pair of young Jedi hyperspace scouts, Gav and Jory Daragon. The siblings were from Sinagar, the capital of the Koro system in the Deep Core. Though the 7 worlds of their home system had prospered after Empress Teta unified them, the Daragon siblings were down on their luck and had attempted one last blind jump in a hope to strike it rich. Implausibly, and with the help of latent force abilities, they had managed to jump from the Deep Core all the way to Korriban, a straight shot across half the galaxy. The Sith had the Daragons captured and their ship impounded, bringing both to the Sith Citadel on Ziost. Sadow and Kressh momentarily put aside their differences while the Sith Council pondered what the arrival of the Republic ship could mean. Kressh and most of the Sith Lords were weary of the Daragons, fearing the siblings were the precursor for a full Republic invasion of the Sith Empire. Kressh urged the other Sith Lords to fortify their worlds and prepare to defend themselves, but where Ludo Kressh saw a threat, Naga Sadow saw an opportunity. He hoped the Daragons could be manipulated into leading the Sith back to the Republic, opening up scores of new worlds to conquer. The Sith Council sided with Kressh over Sadow, voting to execute the Daragons and eliminate any trace of them. Sadow wasn't willing to let his chance to expand the Sith Empire go to waste that easily, however. In the strictest secrecy, he had his agents steal a pair of phase pulse blasters from the Starbreaker 12, which he and his most trusted Masasai warriors used to slaughter the guards in the dungeons of the Sith Citadel and free the Daragons. After ordering the Masasi to escort the Daragons to his personal fortress, Sadow murdered Lord Simus and planted the Republic blasters at the scene. Naturally, the Sith Council interpreted the raid as a Republic attack. Sadow exploited their outrage and shock over the death of Lord Simus to win a majority of the Sith Lords to his side. Over the objections of Ludo Kressh, Naga Sadow was proclaimed Dark Lord of the Sith. Immediately, he and his most loyal Sith Lords began preparing their armies for an all-out assault on the Republic. In secret, Sadow began training Gav Daragon as his apprentice at his secret stronghold on the dark side of Kar Delba, the moon of Kar Xian, where Jory was being held. He sent his Masasi to steal the Starbreaker 12 and bring it to Kar Xian, making sure that he left proof of his involvement at the scene for Ludo Kressh to find. Upon learning that Sadow's warriors had stolen the Republic ship, Ludo Kressh met with Horak Mul and Dor Galram, 2 Sith Lords loyal to him, and conspired with them to attack Sadow's fortress on Kar Xian. The 3 Sith Lords amassed their armies and bombarded Sadow's fortress from the air. As the fortress crumbled around them, Naga Sadow released Jory Daragon and urged her to flee in the Starbreaker 12. Jory complied, not knowing that Sadow's agents had affixed a homing beacon to the vessel. As Jory Daragon fled back to the Koro system, Naga Sadow called forth the fleet he had hidden on the dark side of Kar Delba, catching Ludo Kresh's forces by surprise. As the battle was joined, Sadow executed the final step of his plan. Unlike most Sith Lords, who treated the Masasai no better than slaves, Sadow had always treated his warriors with respect, and in doing so, he had earned the loyalty of the whole warrior caste. On his command, the Masasi aboard Kresh's ships rose up and turned on their lords, killing Horak Mul and Dor Galram. The Masasi took over their vessels and fired on Ludo Kresh's flagship, destroying it. With his enemy apparently vanquished, Naga Sadow assembled his fleet and followed the Starbreaker 12 back to the Republic, beginning the Great Hyperspace War. Without warning, a Sith Armada poured into the Koro system, attacking all 7 of Emperor Tita's worlds. Sadow sent Gav Daragon, who had quickly begun to master the Sith ways, to lead the assault on Sinagar, while the bulk of the Sith fleet moved down the Koros trunk line to attack Coruscant itself. The vast Sith fleet overwhelmed Republic forces at the galactic capital, allowing Sith flotillas to move on from Coruscant and attack Metalos, Shorkin, and Basilisk. The Sith armies seemed endless, but Empress Teta, with the help of Jedi Master Uru, the Jedi Knight Udan and newly anointed Jedi apprentice Jori Daragon, managed to fend them off at Kirek in the Koros system, and from there, joined the battle above Sinagar. There, Jori encountered her brother Gav as he led the Sith forces through the city and managed to show him the error of his ways. Gav fled back to his ship and then his master. Above the red supergiant Primus Golud, Sadow had been coordinating the entire assault from the Meditation Sphere. This vessel had allowed him to create powerful illusions on the beleaguered Republic worlds, making Sith forces seem much larger than they were. But as Empress Teta drove the Sith from the Koros system, Gav returned to Primus Golud and fired on Sadow's mothership, breaking the Dark Lord's concentration. This caused the illusions on Coruscant and the other core worlds to vanish, allowing Republic forces to trounce the attacking Sith. With his forces in disarray, Sadow ordered the Sith to fall back on Primus Golud, but a Republic fleet, led by Empress Teta, followed them there. Knowing that his tattered fleet couldn't win a fight with Teta's, Sadow fled to his battleship, the Corsair, and used an arcane Sith weapon aboard it to destabilize Primus Golud. Sadow used this as cover to flee back to Korriban with what ships he had left, leaving Gav Daragon to die. Furious over this betrayal, Gav sent Teta's ships over Korriban's coordinates, urging them to follow Sadow before Primus Golud went supernova. Naga Sadow fled back to Korriban in disgrace, planning to regroup and prepare for a Republic counterattack. But above Korriban, he found a fleet of ships waiting for him. As it turned out, Ludo Kressh had survived the betrayal at Kashyyyk and had taken over the Sith Empire in Sadow's absence, proclaiming himself the true Dark Lord of the Sith. As Sadow's fleet returned from the core, Kresh's ships opened fire. Even with the Sith Empire under grave threat, Sadow and Kressh fought each other bitterly, wasting what remained of the Sith fleet in one last battle. During the battle, Sadow ordered one of his damaged battleships to ram into Kresh's flagship, destroying both vessels. At last, Ludo Kressh was killed, but Sadow had no time to revel in his victory. Empress Teta and the Republic Navy arrived and tore into the remaining Sith warships, intent on ending the threat of the Sith Empire. Ordering the Massassi to cover him, Sadow fled the system aboard the Corsair, fleeing far beyond the borders of the Sith Empire. At Korriban, Empress Teta and the Republic Navy wiped out the last of the Sith fleet, ending the Great Hyperspace War with a decisive Republic victory. But the Republic campaign didn't end there. Over the course of the next 2 years, the Republic military and the Jedi Order rampaged across Sith space on the orders of Supreme Chancellor Pultimo, who wanted the entire Sith Empire ground to dust. The Sith fought to the last, with all Sith, from priest to slave, expected to die defending the ruins of the Empire. By the time the campaign was over, every last planet in the Sith Empire had been completely depopulated, allowing the Republic to declare victory. Most of the Sith fought to the death or committed ritual suicide, though unbeknownst to the Jedi, several bands of survivors had fled to parts unknown. Both Ludo Kressh and Naga Sadow were given tombs in the Valley of the Dark Lords during the Sith Empire's final days. Naga Sadow had long ago claimed a tomb in the valley for his own, an ancient system of caverns that, unbeknownst to all but a few, contained an ancient star map. He was never interred there, however. Aside from the map, all the tomb contained was a monument. What was left of Ludo Kressh, meanwhile, was interred in a secret tomb on Korriban's Shirak Caves. This tomb lay at the heart of a powerful Force nexus that showed trespassers visions of their past, present, and future. As his rival rotted in the bowels of Korriban, Naga Sadow and his Massassi followers landed on the jungle moon of Yavin 4. There, Sadow planned to wait in exile for the dark side to rise again, ordering the Massassi to build temples in the jungle in the meantime, concealing Sadow's ship and the Sith artifacts he'd salvaged. Naga Sadow waited patiently on Yavin 4 for hundreds of years until the arrival of Friedan Nad, a dark Jedi seeking to learn the Sith ways. Sadow trained Nad only for the Dark Jedi to betray and kill him. Naga Sadow died as he had lived, with treachery.
Revan's choices were always his own. It was not teaching or circumstance or example, it was him And there is something that the Council may never understand, that perhaps Revan never fell. The difference between a fall and a sacrifice is sometimes difficult, but I feel that Revan understood that difference more than anyone knew.
There are few characters from the Star Wars expanded universe that are as prominent as Revan. It's a challenge to be a Star Wars fan and never have at least heard this name before or have seen his iconic mask. Revan is beloved for many reasons. To start, he's supposed to be a self-insert for the player in Knights of the Old Republic, his first appearance, and he's also widely considered to have been one of the most powerful Force users of all time, among the greatest of both the Jedi and the Sith. But more important is who Revan was. His story and the unusual choices that he made are what make his character great. Today, we're going to be diving into both. In 3964 BBY, the Mandalorians launched a massive assault on the Republic, beginning the final and most well-known stage of the Mandalorian Wars. The situation was dire, but to the surprise and anger of many, the Jedi Council opted to stay out of the conflict. But some Jedi objected to the Council's decision. A group of Jedi, led by a knight the Hornet named the Revanchist, set off to prove to the Council that the Order had to act. The Council vehemently opposed the Revanchist and his Crusader followers and even attempted to have them apprehended. The Revanchists were on Cathar when the Jedi Council found them, a world that had been completely depopulated 10 years earlier with no known explanation. As the Jedi Masters tried to apprehend the Crusaders, their leader discovered a Mandalorian mask in the sand of the beach on which they stood, and the whole group experienced a Force vision. Through the vision, they watched as Mandalorians under Cassius Fett drove the Cathar into the sea and massacred them, an indefensible act that left the representatives of the Council shaken. Only one Mandalorian had tried to stand up for the Cathar, the same Mandalorian whose mask the Jedi had found. The leader of the Revanchists claimed the mask for himself, vowing to never remove it until order had been restored to the galaxy. It was then that he finally took the name Revan. The masters that were sent to Cathar refused to arrest the Revanchists, and the Jedi Council reluctantly granted them sanction. The Council still refused to go to war, but didn't stop Malak, Revan's right-hand man, from recruiting large numbers of Jedi to join the cause, including a gifted young knight named Mitra Surik. Revan and his Revanchists became Jedi generals, leading the Republic military in a counter-offensive against the Mandalorians. After Revan, Malak, and a fleet of the Republic's new interdictor warships pushed the Mandalorians back out of the core worlds at Duro, Supreme Chancellor Tol Kressh made him the Supreme Commander of the Republic military, much to the ire of the Jedi Council, and placed a full third of the military under his direct command. The Revanchists began to turn the tide of the Mandalorian Wars, with Revan, Malak, and Mitra Surik becoming particularly famous for their roles in the conflict. But Revan was a step above both of his contemporaries. He was a strategic genius, the likes of which the Mandalorians had never seen, a man who understood how to wage a war. He understood that the key to victory was the industrial might of the Republic, and he harnessed that might and wasn't afraid to sacrifice entire planets to ensure it remained intact. As the wars dragged on, he began to take moral shortcuts, leaving populations to die in order to win crucial battles, and matching the brutal tactics of the Mandalorians blow for blow. And it worked. Under Revan, the Republic did the unthinkable. They pushed the Mandalorians back and launched a counterattack, invading Mandalorian space. Under Revan, the Republic retook worlds like Taris that had fallen in the first wave of the Mandalorian Crusade, and then they brought the war home to the Mandalorians on Doksun and Altair 3. Those two campaigns, though extremely costly for the Republic, broke the back of the Mandalorian war machine. By 3960 BBY, Revan was ready to finish the Mandalorians off, and so he began planning a trap at Malachor 5. Malachor 5 was a distant world on the edges of known space, considered taboo by the Mandalorians. Unbeknownst to everyone except Malak, Revan knew the planet well. He knew that it had a secret. Malachor was home to the Treyas Academy, an ancient Sith site that contained forbidden teachings. Revan visited the world and discovered these teachings, which he introduced to Malak as well, and both of them began to be drawn toward the dark side of the Force. And there was more. On Malachor, Revan and Malak discovered hints of a greater threat lurking in the unknown regions. Above Malachor, Revan set in place a ragtag fleet under the command of Meetra Surik, a fleet that contained the Mass Shadow Generator, a super weapon Revan had ordered to be built for the battle. The Mandalorians couldn't resist the bait Revan had laid out for them, and under the leadership of Mandalore the Ultimate himself, they pounced on Surik's fleet with all that remained of their own. But Revan and Malak joined the Battle of Malachor 5 with another fleet, catching the Mandalorians in a battle on two fronts. Malak and the fleet held the Mandalorians in place as Revan personally boarded their flagship. There, on the bridge, Revan fought Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat, and after a fierce battle, he killed him. He left the ship with Mandalore's mask in his possession, preventing the Mandalorians from choosing a new leader, and then he ordered Meetra Surik to activate the Mass Shadow Generator. The super weapon created a gravitational anomaly that annihilated Malachor and killed untold thousands in the process. Warships, both Republic and Mandalorian, were drawn in toward the planet and crushed. The atrocity turned Malachor into a gaping wound in the Force. The remaining Mandalorians surrendered unconditionally. Revan had them disarmed and they scattered, splintering without Mandalore's mask into warring clans. The Republic was victorious in the Mandalorian Wars, but Revan had bigger concerns. As he lay dying, Mandalore the Ultimate had told him he had been manipulated by the Sith into going to war, and Revan's worst fears were confirmed. He and Malak vanished, heading off into the unknown regions to seek answers. What they found was the true Sith. An empire that waited on the edges of known space to crush the Republic, a threat so unfathomably terrifying that Revan quickly concluded there was no way the Republic would be able to survive it. And it wasn't just the Republic that was in danger, mind you. The true Sith were a threat to life itself. And that was where Revan came into his own. Others would have lost all hope for the galaxy upon finding what he found, while others would have rallied the Republic for a last stand in vain. But Revan did neither. Instead, his was a choice that no other being in the history of the galaxy made. The only way the galaxy would survive the true Sith, he believed, was if it was transformed into a military empire of its own right, a Sith empire. And so Revan became Darth Revan and Malak became Darth Malak, and the two declared themselves the Dark Lords of the Sith. But uniquely, Revan did not fall to the dark side, he chose the dark side, as one would choose a tool, something no other being in galactic history had even been able to do without being consumed. He knew the true Sith had to be stopped and was determined to make whatever sacrifices were necessary to stop them. Together, with newly built assassin droid HK-47, they travelled to Dantooine, Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manaan, and Korriban in secret, discovering Rakatan star maps on each planet. They used these ancient artifacts to triangulate the location of a weapon that they believed was their key to victory, the Starforge. Deep in the unknown regions, in the system which had once been the heart of the Rakatan Infinite Empire, Revan and Malak discovered the key to the ancient power of the Rakata, a massive space station constructed 5,000 years before the dawn of the Republic. The Starforge was a super weapon that consumed stars and the raw power of the dark side to create nearly limitless fleets and armies. Revan used the Starforge to create a massive fleet of warships, swarms of new Sith fighters, new and improved battle armor for his soldiers, and legions of war droids, the foundations of what would become his new Sith Empire. Revan and Malak declared themselves openly in a surprise attack on the Republic shipyards at Forost. There, a huge swath of Republic forces chose to join them, as their allegiance to the heroes of the Mandalorian Wars proved stronger than their allegiance to the failing Senate. Revan made off with a huge portion of the Republic Navy, which he put to use attacking key targets across the Republic, beginning a 3-year-long conflict that became known as the Jedi Civil War. Willing to use the Starforge only to a point, Revan tried to capture crucial manufacturing worlds and other key points cleanly and shifted the brunt of his empire's manufacturing demands onto them as much as he could. But despite Revan's efforts to present the infrastructure of the Republic, he believed true war was against, or rather over, the Jedi. Revan opened a Sith Academy on Korriban to train willing converts and put the Starforge and the Trace Academy, which survived the destruction of Malachor V, to use corrupting the Jedi that had been captured. Revan saw that scarred world as an asset, as by drowning those who walked upon its surface in the horror of the atrocity that had taken place there, Malachor quickly converted Jedi to the dark side. Now, we claimed earlier that Revan never truly fell to the dark side, and so his use of Malachor may seem odd, but he did what he did not out of desire for the supremacy of the darkness, but rather because he understood the true Sith. Places like Malachor, wounds in the Force that corrupted and destroyed life, were the strength of the true Sith. Revan, having lived through the Mandalorian Wars, saw that the Jedi were wholly unprepared for it, and so, instead of letting the true Sith corrupt and turn the Jedi to their side, Revan did it himself. He believed that it was inevitable that the war that was to come would turn the Jedi into the Sith, and so he made sure that they became his Sith. Jedi fell to the dark side and joined Revan's Sith in large numbers, and many of those who did not were killed. Meanwhile, Revan saw to transforming the Republic into his empire. He had beings that he considered destabilizing forces in the galaxy assassinated, either by HK-47, his Sith assassins, or his own hand. On the battlefield, his strategic genius was something that the Republic just couldn't match, and indeed, the only reason it survived at all was because of Bastila Shan, a young Jedi who had the rare gift of battle meditation, which won the Republic just enough battles to keep Revan from total victory. The Jedi Civil War at first went to plan, but Revan had failed to see one massive threat to his plans: Malak. His apprentice had come to resent him, and he had even challenged Revan for his rule of the Sith once, sparking a duel that left Malak without his lower jaw. But Malak got his chance at revenge. In 3957 BBY, the Jedi set up a trap for Revan, luring him into battle against a small Republic fleet. During the battle, a strike team led by Bastila Shan boarded Revan's flagship and attempted to capture the Dark Lord. With Revan distracted, Malak ordered his ship to fire on the bridge of his master's flagship, seemingly killing him. But Revan wasn't killed in that battle. He was severely wounded, but his body was recovered by Bastila, who secretly took him to the Jedi Council. The Council healed him and restored his shattered mind, which they reprogrammed with a new identity: a soldier in the Republic fleet. Revan went on to be retrained as a Jedi, and together with Bastila and a crew of others, he once more tracked down the star maps in a quest to defeat Malak, who was now the Dark Lord of the Sith.
Darth Revan was one of the most well-known Sith Lords of the Old Republic era. Most fans are at least somewhat familiar with his story, that of a hero who fell to the dark side but found his way back to the light. But Revan's greatest contemporary is often neglected by fans: Darth Malak, his apprentice turned rival. This trend existed in-universe too. Malak was always left in Revan's shadow. He was with Revan from the beginning and went further down the dark path than Revan ever did, and yet many fans haven't even heard of him. Today, we're going to change that. In the years following the Great Sith War, a man named Alec was born on Quelly in the village of Squinquar Gesimus. He lived a simple life in his tight-knit community, where the townsfolk were so close that they forsook family names, taking the name of their village as their own. There, he lived a peaceful life, until the day the Mandalorians came. As part of the early stages of the Mandalorian Wars, the Neo-Crusaders swept through the sector, raiding the planet and devastating its civilian population. Alec's village was burned to the ground, and most of the people he'd known all his life were killed by the ruthless Mandalorians. Alec became a refugee, but was rescued from that life by the discovery that he was Force sensitive. The Jedi took him to their enclave on Dantooine for training, where he quickly rose to become one of the Order's most promising students. He became close friends with another Jedi trainee, a man the galaxy would later know as Revan. The two were noted by their masters as being eternally hungry for knowledge, and quickly achieved the rank of Jedi Knight. As the Mandalorian threat continued to spread throughout the greater galaxy, Revan and Alec advocated for the Jedi Order to get involved. The Jedi Council ruled otherwise, declaring neutrality in the conflict, but as the Republic started to come under attack, Revan and Alec rebelled. Together with a group of Jedi followers known as the Revanchists, they broke away from the Order and started aiding the Republic. At first, The Jedi Council tried to have the Revanchists arrested, forcing many of them to adopt aliases to evade capture. It was during this time that Alec began operating under the name Captain Malak, posing as an officer in the Republic Navy. He later adopted the name permanently, though he stopped calling himself Captain. After presenting evidence to the Jedi Council that the Mandalorians had committed genocide on Cathar, the Revanchists were granted sanction and made Jedi generals in the Republic military. Revan and Malak became the military's supreme commanders, each receiving full command of a third of the Republic forces. They and their followers commanded a massive counteroffensive against the Mandalorians, gradually beating them back out of Republic space. Revan was a tactical genius, the likes of which the galaxy had never seen, but Malak wasn't nearly as strategically gifted, quickly developing a reputation as a blunt and aggressive commander. But while Revan was the better general, Malak was much more charismatic. Throughout the Mandalorian Wars, Malak would regularly go on recruiting drives, returning home to Jedi enclaves to talk the students there into joining the war effort. He was responsible for recruiting most of the Revanchists, including Mitra Surik, who would go on to become one of Revan's most trusted generals. On the battlefield, Revan and Malak complemented each other well. Revan was cunning and calculated, while Malak was aggressive and audacious, not unlike how Anakin Skywalker was during the Clone Wars. While Revan preferred to oversee battles from the bridge of his flagship, Malak was much more hands-on. At a full 2 meters in height, Malak was a giant of a man and tremendously strong as well. He was undoubtedly one of the most devastating lightsaber duelists of all time, something many Mandalorians learned the hard way. Over the course of the Mandalorian Wars, Revan and Malak began to slip from the path of the light. They became more accustomed to taking moral shortcuts, sacrificing entire sectors to win crucial battles. But their slide away from the Jedi path largely went unnoticed, as it was helping the Republic win the war. Together, Revan and Malak drove the Mandalorians from Taris, battled Cassus Fett at Jugga Cluster, and wiped out most of the Mandalorian army at Altir. But their most well-known victory was the Battle of Malachor V, the last battle of the Mandalorian Wars. In that final battle, Malak commanded the Republic reinforcement fleet while Revan boarded the Mandalorian flagship, slaying Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat. The Mandalorians were defeated, but Revan and Malak still had work to do. Following markers they found in the Trace Academy on Malachor, Revan and Malak vanished beyond the borders of the known galaxy, following the trail of a dark and ancient threat. Out in the unknown regions, they finally discovered the true nature of this evil. It was a remnant of the original Sith Empire, led by the fanatical True Sith cult. For generations, the True Sith had laid in wait, plotting their revenge against the Jedi and the Republic, and they would soon strike. They had driven the Mandalorians to war to soften up the Republic, and in the aftermath of the Mandalorian Wars, it seemed that no force in the galaxy would be able to withstand them. But Revan was determined to put a stop to these Sith. It wouldn't be easy. Their power was overwhelming and their techniques were tremendously destructive. Both he and Malak knew full well that the Jedi would never be able to win a war against them, as they had seen during the Mandalorian Wars. War of that scale was destructive to Jedi's connection to the Force. Most of the Revanchists had already fallen to the dark side or were at risk of falling. Indeed, Revan and Malak themselves were headed down the dark path. Based on this, Revan came up with a radical plan. He and Malak resolved to become Sith Lords in their own right and corrupt what was left of the Jedi Order. In the war that was to come, it was inevitable that the Jedi would fall to the dark side and become Sith, so Revan and Malak made sure they became their Sith. The Republic too would have to be corrupted, Revan determined. It needed to be reshaped into an empire to combat the Sith threat. This was a tall order, but Revan and Malak had a plan to make it happen, a plan based on discoveries they had made during the war.
Is this wise? The ancient Jedi sealed this archway. If we pass beyond this door, we can never go back. The Order will surely banish us. Are the secrets of the Star Forge so valuable? Can its power truly be worth the risk?
During the Mandalorian Wars, Revan and Malak discovered a number of ancient ruins scattered across the known galaxy. They hinted at the existence of an ancient, galaxy-spanning infinite empire, and at something else far more important than that. Deep within the ruins were the star maps, devices meant to display the location of an ancient superweapon called the Starforge. These maps were damaged and incomplete, but by seeking out a number of them, Revan and Malak were able to triangulate the Starforge's location. They found the weapon above Rakata Prime, a forgotten, unknown region's world, and seized control of it. The Starforge was a massive factory, capable of creating infinite numbers of battleships through the power of the dark side. Upon taking command, Revan set the Starforge to work building on an infinite fleet. He and Malak gathered the Revanchists and many of their other followers at Rakata Prime in secret, where they declared themselves the Dark Lords of a new Sith Empire. Soon after, they began their war against the Republic, the Jedi Civil War. Much of the Republic defected to join their Sith Empire, and the rest could do little against Revan's infinite fleet. When the two became Sith, Darth Revan had taken the title of Sith Master. Darth Malak had grudgingly become the apprentice. But as the Jedi Civil War wore on, Malak grew jealous of his former friend. The dark side began to corrupt him in ways neither he nor Revan had foreseen, in part due to the power of the Starforge. It is said that Revan chose the dark side, as one would choose a tool, and never truly fell, but this wasn't the case for Malak. Though Revan at first led him down the dark path, he travelled further down it than Revan ever did. 2 years into the Jedi Civil War, Malak attempted to kill Revan and usurp the title of Dark Lord of the Sith. The attempt was unsuccessful and cost Malak his jaw. Revan let his apprentice live, but this proved to be a grave mistake. Just a year later, when Revan's flagship was boarded by a team of Jedi led by Bastila Shan, Malak ordered his destroyer to open fire on Revan's bridge, hoping to kill his master and the Jedi in one fell swoop. It appeared he was unsuccessful, at least partially. Revan's flagship was destroyed and the Dark Lord was presumed dead, though Bastila Shan survived. Malak took Revan's place as the new Dark Lord, seizing control of the Sith Empire. The Jedi hoped that the defeat of Revan would cause the Sith Empire to fracture, deeming Malak to be the weaker of the two. They were catastrophically wrong. As soon as he secured his command of the Empire, Malak began a new offensive against the Republic, an all-out campaign of total war that the Republic was entirely unprepared for. Malak had none of his former master's subtlety and tactical ingenuity, but he didn't need it. He had an infinite fleet, after all. As Dark Lord, Malak desperately tried to move out of Revan's shadow. He abandoned Revan's plan for converting the Republic into an empire, choosing brute conquest instead. Where Revan had restrained himself from relying on the Starforge, Malak exploited the space station to the best of his abilities. Fully in the grip of the dark side, Malak was able to achieve a far greater level of control over the Starforge than Revan ever had, displaying his rapidly increasing power. Malak had always played second fiddle to Revan, who was generally considered the more powerful of the two. But during his time as Dark Lord, Malak outstripped Revan in a number of ways. His dark side abilities were much more advanced, and he had always been physically stronger than Revan, making him an equal in lightsaber combat. But Malak's greatest strength was drawn from the Starforge. He used the power of that dark nexus to bolster his power, and in turn, the Starforge became more productive under his command. It became 3 times more productive under Malak than it had been under Revan, churning out even greater numbers of Sith destroyers. Malak also took advantage of the Starforge's corrupting influence in ways Revan had never considered, imprisoning captured Jedi there and draining their power to strengthen himself. Of course, Malak's reign didn't last. As it turned out, Revan survived his assassination attempt and was brought back to the light by the Jedi Council. Together with Bastila Shan, Revan began searching for the Starforge, slaying Darth Bandon, Malak's apprentice, along the way. Malak managed to capture Bastila and convert her to the dark side, declaring her as his new apprentice, but Revan followed him to Rakata Prime. As a Republic fleet attacked the Starforge, Revan boarded the station, redeemed Bastila, and confronted Malak. Revan and Malak fought one last battle, but in the end, the redeemed Revan emerged triumphant. Malak was slain and soon faded into memory, second to his former master, even in death.
Many of the most infamous Dark Lords of the Sith were conquerors, bloodthirsty warlords who built great empires and subjugated swaths of the galaxy. Few of those Sith Lords, however, were able to keep their conquered territory for long. Sith empires had a remarkably short shelf life, and there were only a few in galactic history that managed to stay together for significant periods of time. But there were a few Sith Lords who focused more on the subtleties of statecraft than mindless bloodshed, and they managed to achieve far greater power than many Sith conquerors. One such Sith was Marka Ragnos, a Dark Lord of the first Sith Empire and the architect of the Golden Age of the Sith. In this video, we'll be telling his story. The first Dark Lords of the Sith ruled over the ancient Sith Empire. Established by an exiled Dark Jedi led by Ajunta Pall in 6900 BBY, this empire ruled the worlds of the Stygian Caldera in the Outer Rim, far from the borders of the Republic. Under the rule of great conquerors like Tulak Horde, the Sith Empire expanded from its initial strongholds on Ziost and Korriban to encompass over 120 worlds, plus a few remote colonies beyond the Stygian Caldera. These worlds were split between 10 fiefs, each ruled over by a Sith Lord. The lords who ruled these fiefs sat on a Sith council, advising the Dark Lord of the Sith and their Shadow Hand. During the Sith Empire's first millennium, from the reign of Ajunta Pall to the death of Tulak Horde, it was constantly expanding and subjugating new worlds, enriching itself and its rulers. But by the late 5000s BBY, it had begun to stagnate. The Stygian Caldera, a ring of nebulae that disrupted hyperspace travel, prevented the Sith from expanding beyond a certain point. Once the Sith had fully subjugated the worlds within the Caldera, they had no new vectors for conquest, leading to instability within the Empire. It was in this time of instability that Marka Ragnos was born. From birth, he stood out from his fellow Sith for two reasons. His skin was obsidian black, a rare trait that was held as an omen of greatness among the Sith, and he was also a half-breed, descended from one of the exiled Dark Jedi who founded the Sith Empire. Born into the Kisai priest caste, young Ragnos quickly climbed through the ranks, learning the secrets of the dark side and becoming a Sith Lord. In his day, Ragnos was one of the most powerful lords on the Sith Council, rivaled only by Lord Simus. In 5100 BBY, when the reigning Dark Lord of the Sith died, Ragnos and Simus both aspired to take the Sith throne and fought a duel in the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban. Marka Ragnos triumphed and decapitated Simus, but Simus's head clung to life through Sith alchemical techniques. Simus persisted long enough for his servants to stick his head in a crystal sphere that kept him alive. However, as a head in a jar, Simus was essentially out of the running for the throne of Ziost, and Marka Ragnos became the new Dark Lord. After securing his place as the Dark Lord of the Sith, Marka Ragnos set about restoring the Sith Empire to its former glory. Many years of stagnation had made the Empire increasingly unstable. With no external foes to conquer, the Sith Lords had begun to plot against each other. Such infighting was the way of the dark side, but it threatened to rip the Sith Empire apart. Ragnos was no fool, however. Before a civil war could begin, he took steps to resolve the issue. He began by eliminating all threats to his power, declaring all Sith Lords he thought might openly challenge him enemies of the Sith Empire. He slaked his subjects' lust for blood by unleashing them against each other in contained but ruthless campaigns, which united the Empire against small splinter factions instead of tearing it apart. Once all who might have openly opposed him were exterminated, Ragnos turned to his lesser rivals on the Sith Council, who schemed to assassinate him and take his place. Ragnos carefully manipulated his adversaries, sowing division among them and watching as they destroyed each other. Once his rivals were all dead, Marka Ragnos appointed new Sith Lords to the Council, including Lord Simus, his former adversary. Simus went on to faithfully advise Ragnos for decades, always putting the interests of the Empire first. Ragnos kept the Lords of the Council on a tight leash, assassinating any he deemed potentially schismatic. Through the Sith Council, Marka Ragnos ruled the Empire with an iron fist, quashing all dissent. Though harsh, his reign kept the Sith Empire united, allowing it to grow more prosperous than it had ever been before. So began the Golden Age of the Sith. Over the course of his century-long reign, Ragnos became one of the most powerful Sith of all time. No one could match his skill in the use of the dark side, and few dared to challenge him in combat. As Dark Lord, he crafted an alchemically enhanced sword and black scale gauntlets infused with the power of the dark side, which granted him tremendous strength. He also created a powerful scepter that could absorb force power from dark side nexuses, stripping them of their dark side aura in the process. With this scepter, Marka Ragnos could give non-force sensitives force powers, unleash terrible bursts of dark side power, and even reanimate corpses. With an arsenal like that, it's no wonder he went largely unchallenged. By 5000 BBY, the Sith Empire was stronger than it had ever been before. The Sith Council boasted some of the greatest Sith Lords seen in centuries, including Naga Sadow, Ludo Kressh, Shah Dakan, Horak Mul, Dor Galram, and of course, Simus. However, the prosperity of the Sith Empire came under threat when the unthinkable happened. 100 years after he came to power, Marka Ragnos died, apparently of natural causes. Marka Ragnos had created a golden age of the Sith by consolidating power for himself. When he died, however, he left a huge power vacuum in his wake. The infighting that Ragnos had repressed flared up again before the Sith had even finished with the Dark Lord's funeral, with Sith Lords Naga Sadow and Ludo Kressh vying for Ragnos' place. Together, the two undid everything Ragnos had achieved, destroying the whole Sith Empire in less than a year. That, however, is a story for another time, namely when we discuss Sadow and Kressh in detail next week. Death was not the end for Marka Ragnos. The Dark Lord's spectre persisted, tethered to the world of the living through his scepter. He was limited in where he was able to manifest, however. Though he was able to speak to the Sith Lords assembled at his tomb during his funeral, warning them of the dangers the Empire faced, he was unable to intervene as they plotted against each other on Ziost and other worlds. As the Empire he had built collapsed, Ragnos could do little but sense what was happening from his tomb. The spirit of Marka Ragnos was summoned several times in the millennia that followed. In 3996 BBY, a pair of powerful Sith amulets allowed Ragnos to appear to Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma in a vision, during which he anointed them the new Dark Lords of the Sith. Nearly 4,000 years later, Ragnos also appeared to Darth Plagueis when he visited Korriban. Ragnos declared Plagueis unfit to be the Dark Lord of the Sith, outraged at Plagueis' plans to discard ancient Sith traditions in favor of a more scientific outlook on the dark side. Plagueis responded by asserting that ghosts weren't real and bombarding Ragnos with questions, infuriating the long-dead Dark Lord so much that he chose to return to his tomb. In 14 ABY, after the Sith were wiped out in the Battle of Endor, a cult called the Disciples of Ragnos formed. Led by Dark Jedi Tavion Axmus, the Disciples of Ragnos planned to resurrect Marka Ragnos and bring about a new golden age of the Sith. After acquiring Ragnos' scepter, Axmus traveled to darkside nexuses all over the galaxy, draining force energy from them. When all was said and done, she traveled to Korriban and used the energy gathered in the scepter to summon and empower Ragnos' spirit. Ragnos possessed her body, but then Jedi Knight Jaden Korr, a member of the new Jedi Order, challenged him. The two fought a lengthy battle, and in the end, Korr managed to destroy Ragnos' scepter, vanquishing the Dark Lord's spirit in the process. Marka Ragnos' Golden Age of the Sith was ultimately the only one of its kind. Though later Sith empires would surpass the original empire in power and magnitude, never again would the Sith remain stable and unchallenged for as long as they did under Ragnos.
I sense you, my master. Faint, weak.
Your senses betray you, as you betrayed me.
After all that's happened, still you live. You are difficult to kill.
For one as limited as you, perhaps. To have fallen so far and learned nothing, that is your failing.
The failure is yours. No longer do your whispers crawl within my skull. No longer do I suffer beneath teachings that weaken us. And now you run in search of the Jedi. They are all dead, save one, and one broken Jedi cannot stop the darkness that is to come.
In a recent video about Darth Nihilus, we told the story of one of the most infamous of the old Sith Lords, a walking wound in the Force powerful enough to consume entire planets. But Nihilus was not the only Sith Lord running around the galaxy during the Dark Wars. He was, for a time, allied with another powerful Sith Lord, Darth Sion, the Lord of Pain. When Nihilus was an unstoppable force,
Sion was an immovable object, a man who simply refused to die. He had suffered countless fatal wounds in his lifetime, and his flesh was unrecognizable with all its scars. But he held his body together through the sheer force of his fury. In our opinion, he's actually the cooler and better written of the two Sith Lords, and in this video we'll be telling his story. 3,951 years before the Battle of Yavin during the Dark Wars, the crew of the Republic cruiser Harbinger boarded a Sith warship they encountered on the fringes of unknown space. The ship, it seemed, was empty, or almost empty, rather. A single corpse was found on board, the corpse of a Sith Lord, which Republic soldiers took to their ship's medical bay to study. The doctors ran a quick scan on the body and were horrified by what they discovered. The Sith Lord's flesh was cracked and grey, covered with innumerable burns and scars. His bones appeared to have been shattered, not broken but shattered thousands of times, and then forced back together over and over again. He had suffered so many fatal wounds that the doctors were unable to determine what had actually killed him. But what really horrified them was their determination that all of the Sith Lord's countless injuries had taken place before his death. Before he died, they surmised, he must have been in constant pain. Let's take a few steps back. A full 45 years before the Dark Wars, during the Great Sith War, a man named Sion declared allegiance to Exar Kun, who had set out to bring the galaxy under the rule of a new Sith Empire. He may once have been a Jedi, one of many young apprentices who rose up and butchered their masters on Kun's command one fateful day, causing chaos within the Jedi Order and sparking the Great Sith War. Whether or not this was true, Sion hated the Jedi from the outset and sought battle with them. As a member of the Brotherhood of the Sith, Sion chose to become a Sith Marauder. Marauders focused almost entirely on combat, supplementing their physical strength with force-enhanced battle rage. Sion chose this path and a spot on the front lines of the Great Sith War for one simple reason. He sought to die. We don't know why, but he had lost all desire for life and desired to go down in a blaze of glory fighting a Jedi. But there was a small problem with this plan. He kept surviving. As it turned out, he was quite good at killing Jedi, and while he routinely suffered severe injuries in battles, he always recovered from them. He developed a great tolerance for pain, and he started believing he was immortal, a force for the dark side that no Jedi could hope to stop. However, as the Republic emerged victorious from the Great Sith War, a Jedi finally struck Sion down. But Sion still didn't die. He'd become so convinced of the idea that he was immortal that he refused the possibility of death. Even as he was consumed by terrible pain, he rose up and slew his would-be killer. Sion, who had formerly been eager to die, had become determined to live forever, presumably to keep killing Jedi. He discovered that, through the sheer force of anger and hate, he could hold his body together despite the fatal wound he had endured. This caused him to suffer from intense pain for every moment of the rest of his life, but Sion considered this an acceptable price to pay for immortality. Indeed, his constant pain became a source of strength, increasing his eternal fury. Over time, he even came to define himself by his suffering, deeming himself the Lord of Pain. The decades after the Great Sith War were some of the most turbulent in galactic history. 30 years after the fall of Exar Kun, the Mandalorians launched a massive assault on the Republic, nearly bringing the entire galaxy to its knees. Within months of the Mandalorian War's end, they were followed up by the Jedi Civil War, in which a Sith Empire led by Revan and Malak attempted to do the exact same thing. Darth Sion fought in both of these wars, killing Jedi wherever he could. He received more fatal wounds over the course of these decades, but they didn't even slow him down. After a redeemed Revan defeated Malak at the end of the Jedi Civil War, their Sith Empire imploded. Sion was on Korriban when the Sith in the Academy turned on each other, doing the Jedi's work for them by slaughtering their own kind. Obviously, Sion survived this bloodbath and he left Korriban in disgust, infuriated by what he saw as the weakness of Revan and his fellow Sith. It was shortly after the abandonment of Korriban that Sion was found by Darth Plagueis. She recruited him and Darth Nihilus to be her apprentices, and together they formed the Sith Triumvirate. These three Sith Lords gathered the tattered remnants of Revan's Sith at the Trace Academy on Malachor 5, where they planned the destruction of the Jedi Order. Under Plagueis, Sion endured constant torment and came to master his natural skill of being too angry to die, which he put to use against the Jedi.
Together with the other members of the Triumvirate, Sion formed an order of Sith assassins. Like Darth Nihilus, Sion's contemporary, these assassins fed on the Force within their targets, drawing on it to increase their power and track their enemies. These assassins became quite good at killing, as they also learned to cloak themselves in the Force, which rendered them invisible until they were ready to strike. Sion was largely the one who oversaw the assassins, and he frequently went out with them to kill Jedi himself. While Nihilus roamed the Outer Rim hunting for groups of Jedi, Sion tracked down individual targets, whom he and his assassins cornered and killed. No Jedi survived an encounter with Darth Sion, not even those who managed to strike him down. But over time, there arose a problem that threatened the stability of the Sith Triumvirate. They were running out of Jedi to kill. After Darth Nihilus consumed the planet Katar, there were believed to be no Jedi left in the known galaxy. With their shared mission complete, Sion and Nihilus turned against Darth Traya, confronting her and stripping her of the Force. The two then went their separate ways, believing they had killed Traya, but this wasn't the case. She survived, and in the guise of Kreia, she fled Malachor and sought out Mitra Surik, the Jedi exile. Kreia wasn't the only one looking for Surik, however. Sion believed her to be the last of the Jedi, and so he too sought her out. He tracked her to the Republic warship Harbinger and feigned death to allow the Republic to capture his ship. As the Republic soldiers brought him to the medbay, dozens of cloaked Sith assassins snuck onto the Harbinger, hiding until the time was right. That time came when Kreia arrived in the Ebon Hawk and snuck Mitra Surik off the Harbinger, causing Sion to break the ruse early and attack the warship's crew. He and his assassins took over the Harbinger and used the vessel to fire on the Ebon Hawk, but the freighter escaped, albeit with serious damage. The Ebon Hawk limped to an asteroid mining station near Perigus 2 for repairs, and in time, Sion followed. The Harbinger arrived at the Perigus facility as Surik and Kreia together with Aton Rand were trying to escape. The three of them opted to go through the Harbinger to get to the Ebon Hawk, which was inaccessible from their part of the station. As they worked their way through the warship, Sion confronted them. Kreia opted to hold Sion off while Aton and Mitra escaped, and she distracted her former student, hiding in the shadows to taunt him. But she underestimated Sion's perception, and as she tried to sneak up on him, the vengeful Sith Lord spun around and cut off her left hand. Kreia managed to escape the encounter, however, and she, Surik, and Aton managed to get to the Ebon Hawk and leave the Perigus station. Sion pursued them aboard the Harbinger, trying to shoot their ship down, but his shot struck the fuel-rich asteroids of the Perigus belt instead. The asteroids exploded, sparking a chain reaction that destroyed Perigus 2 entirely. To absolutely nobody's surprise, Sion survived the destruction of Perigus, continuing to pursue Mitra Surik and her companions. They were seeking out the last members of the Jedi Council, 4 Jedi Masters who had escaped the Purge. But 2 could play at that game, and it was Darth Sion and his assassins who got to Lona Vash, one of the 4 Masters, first. Sion captured Vash on Korriban and imprisoned her in the ruins of the Sith Academy, using her to draw Surik to the planet. When the exile arrived on Korriban, Sion killed Vash and then battled the exile, who managed to hold him off for long enough to escape. Sion spent the next few days dwelling on his failure and on Mitra Surik. He realized that he found her beautiful, something that enraged him as he saw it as weakness. Conflicted, he returned to the Trace Academy to plan his next move. Before he moved against Surik again, however, Kreia returned to Malachor, having reclaimed the mantle of Darth Traya. Sion tried to kill her, but she easily subdued him. Reluctantly, Sion agreed to serve Traya once more. Traya commanded him to bring her the exile, unharmed, when she pursued her to Malachor. She revealed that she planned to break Surik, as she had once broken Sion, something that the Sith Lord quietly took issue with. As predicted, Mitra Surik came to Malachor 5, and when she did, Darth Sion was there to confront her. He demanded she leave before Traya destroyed her, but Surik refused, and the two began one last battle. Again and again, Surik struck Sion down, and again, Sion got right back up. He refused to let her pass, determined to keep Traya from breaking her, but he proved unable to overcome the exile despite his best efforts. Surik, on the other hand, was able to erode Sion's will. She convinced him of the futility of his efforts and revealed why she was able to defeat him. Surik had learned to live without the Force, while Sion had become dependent on it, relying on it simply to live. But Sion had nothing to live for. His quest to wipe out the Jedi had proved futile, and at this point, he was just living for the sake of living, at the cost of terrible pain. Sion realized there was a truth in her words. Death wasn't so a terrible thing, he realized, and the Lord of Pain finally allowed himself to die.
I'm glad to leave this place, at last.
In Knights of the Old Republic 2, the source of Sion's story, Darth Sion, like Darth Nihilus, served to illustrate the point that the extreme powers granted by the Force were not power at all, but weakness. We've discussed that outlook in our video on Nihilus, so we're not going to restate it here, and Sion actually has another rhetorical purpose as well. Darth Sion displays the futility and fruitlessness of the dark side, the ultimate trap of the Sith. The Sith were obsessed with cheating death. Many Sith Lords sought the secrets of immortality, and some, like Sion, did manage to find techniques to keep them alive forever. But as Sion realized at the end of his own life, while he had the power to live forever, he had nothing to live forever for. Immortality was a hollow and pointless goal, such that Sion ultimately chose to abandon it to allow himself to die. The dark side is always about wanting more, about trying to be the most powerful, but at the end of the day, that power means nothing if there's nothing to use it for. By the time most Sith reached the apex of their power, they had no purpose in life, as in their pursuit of selfish goals, they no longer cared about anything else. The Star Wars galaxy came under threat from dozens of great Sith Lords over the years, many of which you're probably familiar with. Most Star Wars fans are familiar with Darth Sidious, Darth Plagueis, and Darth Bane. The more knowledgeable ones would add Darth Revan, Darth Nihilus, and Darth Sion to that list as well. But what if we were to tell you that you're sleeping on one of the greatest Sith Lords of all time? The Dark Lord we'll be discussing today was a ruler of the First Sith Empire, an unstoppable conqueror, and an unbeatable lightsaber duelist. He was one of the greatest of his kind in an era when there were many Sith of incredible power. His name was Tulak Horde, and in this video, we'll be telling his story. In Tulak Horde's day, the Sith were much different from the Dark Lords we're familiar with. In those days, they weren't just a cult of Darksiders, they were also a species, a culture, and an empire. The original Sith species, which we'll henceforth call the Sith Purebloods to avoid confusion, evolved on Korriban, but they fled to frigid Ziost after Korriban was rendered desolate in an ancient war. They settled a small scattering of worlds in a remote part of the Outer Rim, cut off from the civilized galaxy by a ring of nebulae called the Stygian Caldera. In 6900 BBY, their civilization was conquered by 12 Dark Jedi, who proclaimed themselves the Lords of the Sith and established the First Sith Empire. The greatest of these Dark Jedi proclaimed himself the Dark Lord of the Sith, the ruler of the Empire. The second greatest became his shadow hand, while the remaining 10 simply became Sith Lords. The 10 Sith Lords sat on a council that ruled the Empire, of which they each controlled a piece. Most of the Sith Lords took on apprentices from among the Sith Purebloods to train in the way of the dark side. They found this an easy task, since most Purebloods were already attuned to the dark side to some degree. These apprentices usually came from the Kisai, the priest caste that had previously been at the top of the Sith hierarchy. Members of other castes, the Zuguruk engineers, the Masasi warriors, and the slaves served the Sith Lords and their apprentices. The original Sith Lords weren't members of the Sith species, but many had offspring with Sith purebloods, allowing their bloodlines to flourish. Their non-Sith genes were quickly dispersed after a few generations, however, and once the last of the original Lords died off, Sith purebloods took the helm of the Empire, following their predecessors' teachings. In the centuries after the founding of the Sith Empire, it steadily began to expand, becoming larger, wealthier, and stronger. But it was routinely hampered by what would become a persistent curse for the Sith Lords: infighting. Some Sith Lords schemed against each other more than they did against the Empire's enemies, and upstart apprentices often banded together to kill Sith Lords and take their place, weakening the Imperial Council. The Sith Empire was in a constant state of flux, bouncing between periods of strength and periods of infighting. Tulak Horde was born into this turbulent political climate. It's never been confirmed exactly when he lived, but our best estimate would be around 6000 BBY. Horde was a Sith pureblood and was taken in for training by Sith Lords at an early age, as the dark side was strong in him. In that time, the Sith were making great strides in the use of lightsabers, developing the art of lightsaber combat far beyond any Jedi equivalents at the time. There were many great lightsaber masters among the Sith in those days, and Tulak Horde quickly became one of them. He was more powerful and more skilled than any of his rivals, and most of his masters as well. His power allowed him to rapidly rise through the ranks and become a Sith Lord. Early in his career, Tulak Horde won a lightsaber duel against a Dashade named Kemval, who pledged his services to Horde after his defeat. Together, Horde and Val mustered a huge army which they put to use suppressing rebellions on the remote Sith worlds N and Shabosh. On the world of N, he single-handedly broke the siege of a Sith citadel and personally led his troops into battle on Shabosh, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. This would be only the first of Horde's many campaigns. While on the front lines, Lord Horde was approached by Aloysius Kalik, a pureblood who aspired to learn the ways of the Sith Lords. Horde initially told him to piss off, but Kalik wasn't planning on taking no for an answer. After his dismissal, he challenged and defeated Horde's best general, leading the Sith Lord to reconsider his dismissal. He took Kalik as his protege, putting him in command of one of his armies. Kalik led Horde's troops to many victories, supporting his master as Horde continued his campaigns against rebellious worlds. During his battles, Tulak Horde used arcane Sith rituals to leech off the strength of his enemies, draining their power to increase his own. This allowed him to win battle after battle, as well as many new titles. He became known as the Lord of Hate and the Master of Gathering Darkness. Soon enough, he even became the Dark Lord of the Sith. Tulak Horde's first act as Dark Lord was to clean house, having everyone he considered a rival killed. This included Lord Kalik, who Horde considered his greatest threat and marked as the first to die. The only being he spared was Kemval, who remained by Horde's side after his ascension. After consolidating his power, Horde escalated the scale of his conquests tenfold, bringing the full might of the Sith Empire to bear against rebellious worlds and newly discovered systems alike. As Dark Lord of the Sith, Tulak Horde became the most powerful Sith Lord to date. He was the greatest lightsaber duelist of his day, perhaps the greatest the Sith ever had, and not even the greatest of warriors could withstand him in combat. Later generations of Sith claimed he slew 1,000 Jedi, though this is questionable since the Jedi were unaware of the Sith Empire at that time. He was also skilled in the art of Sith alchemy, which he used both to enhance his own power and to create dark side imbued artifacts for himself. Though most Dark Lords of the Sith opted to create alchemically enhanced swords to channel their power, Horde instead made a fearsome black mask which he wore often, especially in battle. This mask shielded Horde from the heat of battle and made it harder for his enemies to detect him through the Force. Aside from being the greatest warrior of the ancient Sith, Tulak Horde was also the Sith Empire's most prolific conqueror. He easily quashed any and all rebellions that took place on Sith worlds during his reign, and he also brought new worlds into the Empire, making over 100 conquests of undiscovered planets in his lifetime. Among the worlds discovered by Tulak Horde was Dromund Kaas, the future capital of the reconstituted Sith Empire. The only obstacle Horde could never overcome in his quest to expand the Sith Empire was the Stygian caldera. He was so strong in the Force that he could rip cruisers out of the sky, but not even the power of the Force could move a nebula, nor could it allow Sith warships to fly through it. As Tulak Horde was a master of many things, many Sith sought to apprentice themselves to him. Horde refused nearly all of them, believing that only the strongest were worthy of his knowledge. He wrote a good many books and filled a holocron with his teachings, but he hid all of these in dangerous, hard-to-reach places on Ziost and Korriban, hoping that only the greatest of Sith would be able to find them. Despite his high standards, Tulak Horde did take on one apprentice later in his reign, a man named Ortan Sela. Sela learned a great deal from Tulak Horde, but as with all Sith, he eventually grew ambitious. One day, he stabbed his master in the back, killing him on the spot and denying him the honor of a last battle.
Sela believed he had learned all Horde had to teach and that he would surely take his place as the Dark Lord of the Sith. However, he ended up being insignificant in the grand scheme of things and was outcompeted by more worthy Sith. Tulak Horde's followers entombed him in one of the greatest monuments in the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban. His mask, holocron, and many of his boots were entombed with him and protected by a fearsome array of traps. While the Sith Empire lasted, he was remembered as one of the greatest of the Sith Lords, but knowledge of him faded after the fall of the Empire in 5000 BBY. His tomb was plundered and left in ruins by later generations of the Sith, and many of his teachings were lost. In later millennia, Tulak Horde was known only to a select few, and even then, only among the Sith. Once, Tulak Horde was the King of Kings, the greatest of the Sith Lords, but over the millennia, his legacy faded to nothing, buried beneath the barren sands of the Sith worlds.
The extent of his power cannot be put into words, and his perceptions have grown as well. To him,
you are dust motes in a storm, a grain upon the beach, and as insignificant as a body that orbits the graveyard of Malak.
Most Star Wars fans are at least somewhat familiar with Darth Nihilus, one of the greatest Sith Lords of all time, and with his absolutely terrifying trademark ability, cleansing entire planets of life with the raw power of the Force. But the popular perception of Nihilus as an uber-powerful eldritch abomination belies the true depth and significance of his character. While his raw strength certainly puts the likes of Darth Sidious to shame, describing him as some unstoppable god is actually a fundamental misunderstanding of his character. Today, we're going to give you a better look at the fearsome Darth Nihilus and at the broken Jedi exile who killed him. Our story starts above a small, remote planet called Malachor 5. Long ago, Malachor 5 had been a remote colony of the original Sith Empire, home to the Traya's Academy. The Sith abandoned Malachor when their empire fell, but the Traya's Academy remained, and over the course of 1,000 years, its taint soaked into Malachor, turning it into a beacon of the dark side. Long after Malachor's abandonment, the planet was chosen by Revan to be the last battlefield of the Mandalorian Wars. Revan and his top generals, the Jedi Crusaders Malak and Meetra Surik, planned to lure Mandalore the Ultimate and his fleet into a trap above Malachor, where they would be able to crush the Mandalorians and end the war. Their plan was simple. Surik would lead a small Republic fleet into orbit above the planet to draw the Mandalorians out, and when the battle was underway, Revan and Malak would come in with a fleet of reinforcements, forcing the Mandalorians into a two-front battle. But when the time came to execute this plan, there was a small problem. Revan's fleet was delayed in another system by Mandalorian scouts, and Meetra Surik's fleet ended up having to do more fighting than it could handle. Revan did eventually show up, corner the Mandalorians, and kill Mandalore himself in single combat, but by that point, Surik's fleet had taken serious casualties, and the Mandalorians were dangerously close to overrunning them. With no other choice, she ordered the activation of a super weapon that Revan had put in place as a plan B, the Mass Shadow Generator, a device designed to generate enough artificial gravity to destroy the whole Mandalorian fleet. The Mass Shadow Generator didn't work quite as it was designed, however. The mass shadows it created were too strong, catching both Republic and Mandalorian ships in its area of effect. Worse, it affected Malachor 5, something the engineer hadn't foreseen. Malachor was violently ripped apart by the mass shadow generator and reformed around it, crushing thousands of warships into its fractured crust as it did so. Millions of beings died at once in excruciatingly painful ways, creating a wound in the Force. The effect was so devastating that Force sensitives felt the end of the Mandalorian Wars from across the galaxy. Meetra Surik, the Jedi General at the heart of it all, had to completely sever herself from the Force to survive, something for which she was exiled from the Jedi Order. All this turned Malachor 5 into a wound in the Force. Now, to understand Darth Nihilus, we need to understand wounds in the Force. When particularly terrible atrocities happened, like, say, the destruction of an entire planet, it actually hurt the Force itself, leaving a mark that Force sensitives could detect. When these wounds were inflicted, those attuned to the Force could easily hear the screams of the dead. This is how Obi-Wan sensed the destruction of Alderaan in A New Hope, for example.
I felt a great disturbance in the Force, as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. I fear something terrible has happened.
Normally, wounds in the Force essentially heal themselves, but this wasn't the case with Malachor. What had happened in the last battle of the Mandalorian Wars was so terrible that the wound in the Force was unable to heal on its own. To make matters worse, the power of the Traya's Academy, which had survived the mass shadow generator, amplified the effect of this wound. The screams of Malachor became an echo that spread across the stars. This echo worsened existing wounds in the Force across the galaxy, deepening the scars of war and subtly influencing living things, causing beasts to become vicious and sentient to grow cruel. Over the course of the next decade, as the Jedi Civil War and the Dark Wars left more and more wounds in the Force, the effects began to compound each other. These echoes became centered around Meetra Surik, the Jedi exile, which is why she had to give up her connection to the Force. But she wasn't the only one to meet with such a fate. It was from Malachor V that Darth Nihilus was born. Who he was before is unknown and unimportant, for through that terrible battle, he became a walking wound in the Force. He learned an ancient Sith art that allowed him to drain the life forces of others, consuming them to increase his power. But this sort of Force vampirism wasn't just some special ability. Nihilus was dependent on it. He had to feed, or else the hunger would consume him instead. This hunger and Nihilus's ability to feed came from Malachor. He, like Meetra Surik, was a concentration of the echoes spreading from that wound in the Force, and the more people he consumed, the stronger those echoes became. Over the course of the Jedi Civil War, between Revan's Sith Empire and the Republic, Darth Nihilus became more and more powerful, to the point where he was able to consume entire planets at once. His power was strengthened even further when he, along with Darth Sion, became an apprentice of the Sith Lord Darth Traya after the end of the Civil War. The Republic had won the war, but their victory, as in the Mandalorian Wars, had been a Pyrrhic one. The Jedi were on the verge of extinction, and as the tattered remnants of the Sith regrouped under this Sith triumvirate at the Traya's Academy, they began to plot their revenge. Using the Force, Nihilus ripped a downed Republic battlecruiser, the Ravager, out of Malachor's blackened crust, the start of what became a whole fleet of ghost ships, held together through the sheer might of Nihilus's will. He and his fleet roamed the interstellar void, hunting Jedi. What followed was the first Jedi Purge. Whenever Jedi gathered somewhere, the Ravager was sure to follow, and Nihilus would consume the Jedi, their allies, and all other life on the planets where they sought refuge. The numbers of the Jedi dwindled rapidly until, after Nihilus consumed what was believed to be the last Jedi at the Mirror-Luke colony of Qatar, the Order was no more. On Qatar, Nihilus left only one living thing alive, Visas Marr, a Mirror-Luke Force adept. Nihilus claimed her as his assassin, and unlike the half-dead slaves who served aboard his ships, he didn't consume her. Instead, he converted her to his cause. As his power grew to unfathomable heights, Nihilus had come to believe that all life deserved to die. He believed that he brought order where there was chaos, stillness and silence where there had been nothing but meaningless noise. Everything, to him, existed to feed his will. With their shared mission complete, Nihilus and Sion then betrayed Darth Traya, cutting her off from the Force and leaving her for dead. Then they went their separate ways. But unbeknownst to either of them, Traya survived. She sought out the person who was then believed to be the last of the Jedi, Meetra Surik, the Exile. By that point, it had been 10 years since Malachor, and in that time, Surik had wandered the fringes of the galaxy, seeking solace in isolation and exile. But under the guidance of Darth Traya, who at that point had taken the name Kreia, she returned to the civilized galaxy, and at length she began to regain her connection to the Force. Nihilus sensed this and sent Visas to kill Surik, only for Visas to join forces with the Jedi Exile instead. Surik and her companions were, at the time, traveling around the galaxy looking for other Jedi and putting a stop to Sith plots. When Nihilus's servants attempted to conquer Onderon by supporting the would-be usurper General Vaklu, the Exile and her followers swayed the tide of the battle, dealing a blow to the Sith Lord. By that point, the hunger was beginning to turn on Nihilus. He had become so powerful that only planets were massive enough to sustain him, and he had planned to feed upon Onderon. Kreia knew of this, and so, through one of Nihilus's servants, she led him to believe that there was a Jedi Academy on Telos 4, knowing that Nihilus would be unable to resist such a target. But it was a trap. There were no Jedi on Telos, and Kreia had made sure that Surik would be there when he came for the planet. Together with Mandalore the Preserver and his greatest warriors, Surik and Visas Marr boarded the Ravager as it attacked Telos and confronted Nihilus. Surik revealed how Kreia had tricked the Sith Lord and offered herself up to him. But when Nihilus attempted to feed on the Jedi exile, he felt only the Force wound that she carried within her. Weakened, he was easily slain by Surik, who went on to destroy Malachor 5 and heal the wound in the Force for good. Those of you who haven't played Knights of the Old Republic 2, the game this entire story comes from, might be scratching your heads right about now. How, you might ask, could a Jedi exile who had only just started to use the Force again defeat someone as powerful as Darth Nihilus? The answer lies in one of KOTOR 2's most important themes.
Greatest Jedi Knight strip away the Force, and what remains? They rely on it, depend on it more than they know.
Central to the story of KOTOR 2 is the philosophy of Kreia, a deconstructive assessment of the Force. Darth Nihilus embodied a core element of this outlook, that strength drawn from the Force isn't strength at all, but rather dependency. In terms of raw power, Nihilus was unmatched. Not even Darth Sidious could consume worlds like that. But in the end, it didn't matter. The Jedi exile proved stronger because Nihilus relied on the Force, and Mitra Surik, alone among anyone in the galaxy, had learned to live without it. This is because the power the Force granted Nihilus was never truly his to command. Nihilus was a leech. He drew constantly on the strength of others, and in doing so, he only ever weakened himself. He was a slave to his hunger. Whenever he couldn't feed, he started to consume himself, and so he was forced to always be on the hunt. Visas Marr once remarked to Mitra Surik that his power had grown so great that he could no longer be considered a man. He had become an entity, something that didn't even take notice of individuals anymore, being concerned only with planets. But that doesn't show strength. It shows how utterly impotent Darth Nihilus actually was. He'd become so reliant on the Force that his power was all that really remained of him. But that power wasn't his. It was the echo of Malachor, an external force. As Visas discovered after his death, behind his mask, Darth Nihilus really was just a man, nothing more. He was irrelevant, unimaginably weak, such a thrall to his power that he himself may as well have ceased to exist. Mitra Surik was the opposite. In giving up the Force, she had broken her chains completely, and even when she started to regain her powers, the strength of that act remained. The Force no longer controlled her. Thus, she was able to not only kill Nihilus, but do so with relative ease. Darth Nihilus was one of the most powerful Sith Lords of all time, but ultimately, that power meant nothing.
Do you feel it is a... You are the darkness in which all life dies, my lord. All life exists to feed your power. And my life is yours.
Visas Marr was a Miraluka, a member of a rare, near-human species. The Miraluka had no eyes, and thus, by human standards, were naturally blind. Despite their lack of eyesight, however, the Miraluka could still see. They saw through the Force, perceiving the currents and patterns of life and using that sense to navigate. As you might expect, the Miraluka were naturally Force sensitive, and Visas, in particular, was quite strong in the Force. Visas lived on Katar, a beautiful Miraluka colony world in the Mid-Rim. It was a somewhat obscure planet as the Miraluka were rather reclusive, but it wasn't completely cut off from the outside galaxy. In particular, Katar kept close ties with the Jedi Order, as the Miraluka had an easier time connecting with beings who could also see the universe through the Force. This close bond led the Jedi to choose Katar as the site of a conclave in 3952 BBY. The Conclave came 4 years after the end of the Jedi Civil War, which saw the Order's numbers ravaged by the Sith. To make matters worse, in the years since, the number of Jedi had dwindled further. Some unseen threat was preying on Jedi, attacking them through the Force, and they were unable to determine what it was, aside from some new breed of Sith. One fateful day, nearly all of the surviving Jedi gathered on Katar to determine the nature of this threat, hoping that being close to Miraluka would enable them to reveal their enemy. The Jedi succeeded, but not in the way they'd hoped. By gathering on Katar, they had inadvertently drawn Darth Nihilus to them. Visas Marr later recounted that those gathered on Katar never saw Nihilus's face, but all heard his voice, and when he spoke, Katar died. The Lord of Hunger stripped the entire planet of the Force, killing not only the assembled Jedi, but also the Miraluka and all other living things on the colony, from sentient beings to microbes. Nihilus consumed the Force energies of every life form on the planet, every life form save one. Visas Marr survived the attack on Katar. Nihilus spared her. But what Visas felt while Katar died all around her seemed a far worse fate than what her people had suffered. As a Miraluka, she saw through the Force, and after Nihilus's attack, she found herself well and truly blind. Everything around her had crumbled to dust, and she was terribly alone, afraid, and in great pain. As Visas lay reeling from the shock of what had just happened, Nihilus himself descended to the ashen surface of Katar to retrieve her. He took Visas to his ship, the Ravager, a ghost ship dragged from the graveyards of Malachor 5. She awoke aboard the dead ship to find her face mutilated. The skin over the place where her eyes would otherwise have been had been carved away. After awakening, Visas found her way to Nihilus, who was waiting on the bridge. When Visas arrived, Nihilus showed her a vision through the Force, allowing her to see as ordinary beings saw.
He made me see. And for the first time, I saw the galaxy. And I wished to die. To this galaxy, my world, absent the currents and spectrums of the Force, was nothing but crude matter, rock, flesh, emptiness. He showed the flickering of life on other planets. The mass of beings that swarm through the empty places of the galaxy. To see such creatures, disconnected from themselves, their world, their place in it, unable to see the currents and how they affected everything around them. He showed me to make me believe in his cause. He convinced.
The vision Nihilus showed Visas severely damaged her ability to see through the Force, and it also made her into a willing ally. The Lord of Hunger showed Visas how disconnected and chaotic other beings were, the wretchedness and waste that was life. In doing so, he convinced her that it all deserved to die. He would purge it all, turn chaos into order, and replace the meaningless cacophony with an endless, perfect silence. Nihilus invited Visas to aid him in this cause, and Visas accepted, becoming his Sith apprentice. Nihilus gave Visas a meditation chamber aboard the Ravager, a great room where, when she was focused in the Force, she could hear the voices of the dead Katar. She searched through the Force, looking for oddities and Jedi for Nihilus to feed upon. When she found something, Nihilus would dispatch her to hunt it down and bring it back to him. To this end, he trained Visas in the use of a lightsaber and several powerful Force techniques. She put these to good use. None survived an encounter with Visas Marr until one fateful day. A year after the death of Katar, Visas felt something new in the Force, an echo, a wound, which carried pain similar to what she had felt at Katar. Nihilus sent her to track down this oddity and bring it back to him, and Visas obeyed, partly out of loyalty and partly curiosity. She soon discovered the source of the wound. It stemmed from Mitra Surik, the Jedi exile, who had returned to known space after a decade beyond the edge of the Republic. Visas snuck aboard Surik's ship, the Ebon Hawk, and confronted the exile when she returned from an adventure on Nar Shaddaa. Visas and Surik fought a fierce but brief lightsaber duel which ended with the exile victorious. Visas was wounded and her lightsaber was destroyed. She begged Surik to kill her, but the exile refused. Visas lapsed into unconsciousness. With the help of the Ebenhawk's crew, Visas recovered from her wounds. When she awoke, she pledged herself to the exile's service in gratitude for sparing her life. Surik accepted Visas and forgave her for the earlier attack, an act of kindness Visas was not expecting. She had not seen kindness in a long time and she had forgotten the power of compassion. Visas promised to protect the exile but warned Surik that she would eventually have to face Nihilus. Visas hoped that Surik would be strong enough to defeat the Lord of Hunger, but she still feared for Surik's safety and repeatedly warned her that Nihilus was not to be taken lightly. He was so powerful, Visas claimed, that he could not even be considered a man anymore, only a being of raw power. Many of Surik's companions were uneasy about having a Sith assassin aboard the Ebenhawk, but Kreia, Surik's mentor, advised that Visas represented an opportunity. Kreia sensed that Visas was in some way linked to Nihilus as a result of his sparing her. She advised Surik that this could be exploited, urging the exile to manipulate Visas into killing herself when the time came to confront Nihilus, insisting that it could help defeat the Lord of Hunger. But Surik rejected this idea, instead choosing to train Visas along with several of her other companions in the ways of the Jedi. Visas Marr accompanied Mitra Surik on her journeys across the galaxy. Along the way, Visas unlearned many of the Sith techniques Nihilus had taught her, instead studying the ways of a Jedi Sentinel. Surik repaired her lightsaber and returned it to her, and Visas proved an asset to the crew. As she traveled across the galaxy, Surik only grew stronger, and Visas became increasingly hopeful that the exile could indeed defeat Darth Nihilus. Still, she continued to fear that Surik would still be unable to overcome her former master and dreaded how the encounter would scar the exile. At the same time, Visas found comfort in Surik's company. After her battle with the exile, Visas's foresight had begun to return and she saw Surik for what she really was, someone deeply wounded but also strongly connected to life around her. In Mitra Surik, Visas saw proof that, perhaps, Nihilus had been wrong about the universe. What's more, Visas saw some of herself in Surik. She saw that she was not the only one in the galaxy who had been wounded, and that the revelation that she was not alone gave her a newfound sense of hope and purpose. Surik saw this, and she and Visas worked through each other's wounds, with each finding healing through the other. With Surik's help, Visas started to overcome the pain she had carried since Qatar. As Visas foresaw, the time eventually came for Surik to confront the Lord of Hunger. When Nihilus attacked Telos 4, seeking to cleanse it of life, Surik and the crew of the Ebenhawk rushed to the planet's aid. While the Republic Navy held off the Ravager and Nihilus's other ships, Surik, Visas, and a team of Mandalorians boarded the Sith Lord's flagship, planning to plant bombs across the vessel, defeat Nihilus, and then blow the ship to hell. As they made their way through the Ravager, the team came by chance to Visas' old meditation chamber. She took the opportunity to use it, to hear the voices of Qatar one last time.
Past the surface there is the Force. Where once there was a world that was strong in the Force, now there is a barren wasteland.
It's okay. It's gonna be fine.
It has taken time for me to return here. I lost my way, but I've been stronger for the journey.
It's okay. It's gonna be okay. It's gonna stop.
What happens now shall not be done out of hate or revenge, but for the sake of all life. And I ask you, finally, to forgive me. This body is a prison no longer.
With the help of the exile, Visas Marr came to terms with the death of her homeworld, vanquishing the pain she had been carrying within her. Now healed, Visas led Surik and Mandalore the Preserver to the Ravager's bridge,
where Darth Nihilus awaited. When Nihilus learned that Visas had betrayed him for the exile, he was livid and threatened to destroy his former apprentice. But Surik offered herself up, suggesting that Nihilus could feed upon her instead of Visas. Nihilus tried, but upon feeling the wound in the force within Surik, he recoiled, shaken by the experience. With Nihilus stunned, Surik, Visas and Mandalore took the opportunity to attack the Sith Lord. Even weakened, however, Nihilus's power still seemed overwhelming. He was an entity of raw, unfathomable power, so much greater than any mortal man, and for a moment, Visas lost all hope of defeating him. She offered to kill herself to weaken Nihilus, knowing she had a link with the Sith Lord that could be exploited, but Surik instead suggested she try to draw the bond herself. Visas did so, and managed to temporarily cut Nihilus off from the Force. She, together with Surik and Mandalore, then slew the Lord of Hunger. After Nihilus's death, Visas lingered for a moment by his body, even as Surik and Mandalore turned to leave. Wishing to see her former master for what he truly was, Visas removed his mask and looked upon what remained of the force of nature she had once feared. When Surik asked what she had seen behind Nihilus's mask, Visas said only that she had seen a man, nothing more. Visas Marr went on to accompany Surik to Malachor 5, where the exile had her own wounds to tend to. After Malachor, Visas and Surik parted ways. Surik left for the unknown regions, while Visas and the others stayed behind to rebuild the Jedi Order. Visas went on to become a great Jedi Sentinel, and one day, long after she parted ways with Surik, she returned to the ashen surface of Qatar, and there at last found peace. Welcome to Dromund Kaas, where freedom goes to die and legends are forced on the galaxy. On this channel, we like to highlight how the Sith Empire suffered as a result of infighting and Sith Lords constantly undermining each other. These petty squabbles would split entire armies and pit a master against his apprentice, often giving the Republic and the Jedi a chance to regroup and mount an effective resistance. There was one Sith, however, who saw past petty Sith politics and wanted to bring the dark side directly to the masses. In this video, we tell the story of Darth Jadus, the Sith who wanted to democratize fear. Very little is known about Darth Jadus other than that he was a human male and was probably born on Dromund Kaas. He was a powerful Sith Lord, second only to Emperor Vitiate, who even referred to him as the best Sith his empire ever produced. For someone with so much power, Jadus was a secretive and cunning individual who, as per the Sith Mask mandate, never revealed his face to anyone. He gained recognition among the Sith during the Great Galactic War, and later during the Cold War, joined the Sith Dark Council. As a member of the Dark Council, Jadus was in charge of the sphere of intelligence and ran the Imperial network of spies and saboteurs with great success, frequently promoting and training other non-Force users instead of Sith to be his agents, much to his peers' annoyance. He religiously followed the Sith mask tradition, encasing his entire face and never once revealing his true identity. Despite being a Sith, he never gave in to his rage or passion, hiding the emotions that fueled the dark side within him. He was cold and calculating, choosing to focus his brilliance on developing his agents and spy network. He had little interest in the squabbles of fellow Sith, seeing them as obstacles the Empire needed to overcome to reach its full glory. To understand Jadus, we have to understand the Empire he was a part of. After suffering a humiliating defeat in the Great Hyperspace War, the survivors of Naga Sadow's failed campaign against the Galactic Republic were desperate to escape the impending extermination of their species. They started making random hyperspace jumps and scouting missions for new worlds they could call home. It was around this time that a certain Sith Lord named Vitiate ordered his historians and researchers to search for the long-lost Sith colony world named Dromund Kaas, whose location had been lost during the Great Hyperspace War. The reconstituted Sith Empire, also known as the True Sith Empire, was built by these survivors, who eventually reached and repopulated Dromund Kaas. Dromund Kaas was the third planet in the Dromund system in the Outer Rim's Estran sector. It had 2 moons and orbited the star Dromund. Vast jungles and oceans originally covered the planet's surface,
and it once played host to a colony of the Sith Empire until knowledge of its location was lost during the Great Hyperspace War. Sith Emperor Vitiate rediscovered it in 4980 BBY. The Sith reconstituted into the Sith Empire and made Kas City on Dromund Kaas their new capital. For the next 1,000 years, they slowly reshaped the planet's surface, with jungles giving way to cities with towering skyscrapers. The Sith Empire was ruled by the Dark Council, which was composed of 12 members who each held the title of Dark Lord of the Sith. Each Sith Lord wielded considerable power and influence, answering to no one except the Sith Emperor. Membership meant one was considered one of the most powerful Sith Lords of the time, and when a member was killed or assassinated, their apprentice was the first Sith considered to replace them. During the reconstitution of the Sith Empire, the Dark Council was in charge of the day-to-day duties of running the Empire. Darth Jadus served on the Dark Council as one of its most powerful members and was in charge of Imperial Intelligence, one of the 12 spheres of influence in the Sith Empire. Jadus hated the bureaucracy and constant squabbling. He plotted against the Dark Council, seeking to take them out, unify the Empire, and bring the ways of the Sith to ordinary citizens. For all intents and purposes, he wanted to democratize the Sith teachings and allow normal people to tap into their fear and anger. Jadus was incredibly powerful and knowledgeable in the dark side of the Force. He was a master of the usual Sith powers such as Force Choke, Force Lightning, and Force Corruption. Weaker minds stood no chance against his mind tricks, and he could also teleport. He possessed the rare ability of Force Healing like Barriss Offee, but he probably only used it on himself. He fought with a single-bladed red lightsaber, and legend has it that simply standing beside him caused others to feel physical pain due to the dark side energy that he radiated. A mysterious yet imposing figure among the Sith Dark Council, Darth Jadus was known for his cold and calculating demeanor as well as his brilliance. While firmly in the dark side, he refrained from showing public signs of rage or passion, unlike some later Sith.
I believe FN 2187 may have helped in the escape.
He chose instead to keep his emotions to himself and fuel the dark side of the Force and increase his power. He was strangely meritocratic, choosing agents based on their ability and not their Sith heritage, and was strongly opposed to the xenophobic policies of the Empire, openly recruiting aliens into the Imperial Intelligence Network. He held little interest in the politics of the Council, seeing their power struggles as petty squabbles that held back the Empire from reaching its true potential. His behavior would make his fellow council members uneasy, but his followers more devout. He also had a daughter who later became his only apprentice. The Sith Empire faced its own fair share of rebels and terrorist organizations, and 3,643 years before the Battle of Yavin, Jadus was tasked with uncovering the Eagle's network, a duty he handed off to a new intelligence agent later known as Cypher 9 or Night Shrike. The terrorists staged an attack on Kaas City, targeting its main power generators while at the same time bombing the Dominator, a BSX-5 Harrower-class dreadnought that served as Jadus's flagship. Cypher 9 intercepted the terrorists on Kaas and thwarted their attack, but news reached the capital that the Dominator had been bombed and thousands of Sith dignitaries and slaves were dead, Jadus presumably among them. Jadus's death led the Dark Council to appoint his daughter, Darth Zorid, to his position. Zorid ordered all intelligence resources and agents to find Eagle, the terrorist organization's leader, and make her pay for her crimes. Cypher 9 was given the assignment and successfully dismantled the entire network, eventually finding and killing the terrorist leader called Eagle. The Eagle had been experimenting with new Imperial weapons called Eradicators, which were part of a satellite-based weapons system. Cypher 9 also discovered that Eagle was working for a mysterious patron high up in the Empire, and their investigation eventually led them to realize that Darth Jadus was the true leader of the Eagle network. Jadus had faked his own death and planned to use the Eradicators to wipe out the Dark Council and use the ensuing chaos to unite the Sith Empire under his rule. Fun fact, Darth Jadus's name is actually an anagram for Judas, which foreshadows his betrayal. Cypher 9 discovered the Dominator intact with a very much alive Darth Jadus hiding out in deep space. Darth Jadus demanded that Cypher 9 give up their half of the Eradicator codes which they had taken when they defeated Eagle. With these, Jadus could activate his weapons of mass destruction. Since Cypher 9 and Jadus only appear in BioWare's Star Wars The Old Republic video game, there are actually 4 possible outcomes depending on Cypher 9's choice regarding the betrayal of Jadus. 2 light side paths lead to Jadus escaping but the Eradicators being stopped. Another path involves playing along with Jadus until he's distracted and captured by the Dark Council, while the 4th involves Cypher 9 joining Jadus and firing the weapons, earning the nickname Hand of Jadus. The Old Republic gave us many badass Sith. Some were Lords of Pain, some Planet Eaters. Many just really needed to chill. But there are a few people who would deny that Darth Malgus was easily one of the most formidable and epic Sith to have existed. All too often, Sith are portrayed as caricatures of evil, people twisted by the dark side and hell-bent on some outlandish scheme, like unleashing an army of techno-beasts or consuming the entire galaxy. Malgus wasn't like any of those Sith. In many ways, he was what one would call reasonable, at least for a Sith. So much so that many people actively choose to side with him. Because Malgus wasn't just a Sith. He was a Sith with an ideology he believed in, and someone who would give it his all to see his visions for his home come to reality. Darth Malgus was born as Veridon on the stormy world of Dromund Kaas in the year 3700 BBY. Longtime fans who've watched our series on the history of the Sith will recognize the era we're in. Following the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War, the galaxy had been at peace. With the disappearance of Revan, the Republic thought the Sith fully eradicated. That wasn't the case at all. A Sith Lord by the name of Vitiate had escaped with a group of loyal followers, leading a nomadic lifestyle for some time before they settled on the long-forgotten world of Dromund Kaas. There, Vitiate took the title of Dark Lord of the Sith and slowly rebuilt his Sith forces. Veridon was raised by a scientist in the Imperial Science Bureau and grew up tending to his father's zoological collection. From a young age, Veridon was trained in the ways of the Force, but also in deception, expectations, and personal conduct. These early teachings instilled in the young Sith a strong personal code of morals, which he abided by throughout his life. After some time training at the Sith Academy, Veridon was taken on as an apprentice by Darth Vindican and finally took on a new Sith name, Malgus. During a trip to Geonosis, Malgus encountered a Twi'lek slave being abused by her owner, whom he killed. He took the Twi'lek on as his own, and despite her official status as a slave, he took her as his lover and treated her with respect. Keep this in mind for later. After 400 years of seeming peace, the Sith Empire attacked. One of the Sith's first targets in 3681 BBY was the holy world of Korriban, which the Jedi had kept under their control for centuries. Malgus and his master Vindican took 2 Fury-class interceptors and boarded the Republic space station above the planet. The 2 Sith landed in the hangar bay, preventing anyone from escaping and sounding the alarm. But they had Jedi to contend with. Vindican took on the Zabrak Jedi Master Kal Sendarak, while Malgus fought his Padawan Satil Shan. Initially, Malgus was pushing her back effortlessly, but when the Jedi's Master passed her one of his lightsabers, she recovered. Vindican attempted to unalive the Padawan, but yet again, her Master saved her, then ordered her to escape. Enraged that his prey was fleeing, Malgus teamed up with Vindican against the Zabrak Master, who fought them off valiantly. Despite it being a 2v1, Darak managed to severely wound Vindican. Even though he evened the odds, Malgus proved too powerful and cut him, and eventually his master, down, liberating Korriban for the Sith. From then on, Malgus believed he was the one destined to bring about the fall of the Republic and the Jedi. Following their victory on Korriban, the Sith began expanding throughout the galaxy, taking over vast swaths of territory in the Outer Rim and heading coreward. By 3667 BBY,
Malgus had been promoted to the rank of Darth, recognized for his power and tactical genius. For those reasons, most likely, he was selected to lead a Sith invasion on Alderaan. In a past video, we've detailed the fateful Battle of Alderaan. Using an attack from the Imperial fleet as a ploy to draw the Republic forces far away, Malgus bombarded the planet from orbit, then landed thousands of troopers and droids alongside hundreds of Sith planetside. Malgus himself took point, leading a pilgrimage of fire and ruin through the planet's rich cities and lush forests. Unfortunately for Malgus, members of Havoc Squad, an elite Republic Spec Ops team, had remained planetside for unrelated reasons. The commandos launched a guerrilla attack against the invading Imperials. Among these soldiers was Jace Malcolm, who would have died at the hands of the Sith had Satil Shen, now a Jedi Knight, not intervened. Jedi and Sith began to duel in earnest, relying on both their lightsabers and the Force to pulverize their opponent. With some help from Malcolm, Shan was eventually able to defeat the Sith, first throwing him into a cliff, then bringing the cliff down on top of him. With Malgus presumed dead, his Sith forces were routed, especially when Republic reinforcements returned to the system. The Battle of Alderaan was lost for the Sith, but Malgus survived, albeit with critical injuries. He would return to the battlefield, but since his defeat at the hands of Satil Shan, he relied on a rebreather. But Malgus wasn't held back for long, regardless of his injuries. During the later half of the war, he was in charge of the Sith Empire's Outer Rim campaign. After the Sith Empire failed to provide him with adequate support, he lost Ord Radama to the Republic and was forced to flee towards Sith space with his remaining forces. He was pushed back to Ziost, which also fell to a Republic advance, but was able to repel them at Asher's Re against all odds. Malgus's victory was highly praised, so much so that the Sith government promised him unfailing support in future battles. Despite the betrayal of an inside agent, Malgus was also able to retain Sith control of Sereno, much to the displeasure of the local noble houses. Later on, Malgus was tasked with retaking Ord Radama, which he believed would restore his honor. This time, he planned for it perfectly. With a Sith assault on the planet's new capital city backed by droids, troopers, and Imperial commandos, the city fell quickly. The battle for control of the planet lasted several weeks due to Jedi interference, but Malgus was eventually victorious. His victory did, indeed, restore the Empire's faith in his skills, which earned him a place on the invading force that was gathering, because the Sith weren't satisfied with taking over half the galaxy. The Great Galactic War had been raging for almost 30 years, and while the Sith Empire was overall coming out on top, the war wasn't something they could sustain in the long run. What the Empire needed was one final debilitating blow that would bring the Republics to its knees and force a surrender. In 3653 BBY, the Sith Empire reached out to the Republic and offered peace. The peace talks were to take place on Alderaan, where representatives of the Sith Empire, the Republic, and the Jedi would meet. However, this was yet another ploy. While the Republic was distracted with the promise of peace, Darth Angral and Darth Malgus were tasked with assaulting Coruscant. The former would focus on assaulting the planet itself, while Malgus was to attack the Jedi Temple located in the capital. Remembering his old vow to wipe the galaxy clean of the Jedi, Malgus took to his assignment with verve. Malgus's plan was simple. He was to enter the temple alone, serving as a distraction so that 50 Sith could slip inside and destroy the planetary defense mechanism housed within the edifice. With Coruscant's defenses down, Angral could swoop in and rain destruction down upon the jewel of the Republic. When Malgus made his appearance, the Jedi took to his presence with extreme prejudice. Temple security guards first tried to stop him, but he dispatched them easily. Jedi Knights amassed at his location, including Zalo, whom Malgus had faced off against on multiple occasions. But Sith reinforcements soon arrived, tipping the scales in Malgus's favor. The battle was fierce. It was an all-out free-for-all with combatants like Malgus, Zalo, Adras, and Daru, Malgus's Twi'lek wife, trying their best to defend their allies and kill their enemies. Despite the Sith's numerical advantage, the Jedi were powerful, which infuriated Malgus. But they had reached a tipping point.
When Zalo injured his wife, Malgus went into a berserker rage from which he drew the strength to annihilate the enemies before him. He cut down Jedi after Jedi until he had finally killed Zalo, leaving his body in the burning husk of the Jedi Temple. From its burning entrance, Malgus watched the planet city fall to the hands of the Sith in a hail of fire and agony. With the Republic's capital falling into Sith hands, the Republic had little choice but to offer a complete surrender. The results of the sacking of Coruscant was the Treaty of Coruscant, which leaned heavily into the Empire's favor. Despite peace falling between the two superpowers, the galaxy was holding its breath, and Malgus, he was biding his time. Contrary to what one might expect, Malgus did not leave Coruscant a satisfied man. On the one hand, he was overjoyed to have brought ruin to the Jedi Temple and watched the Republic capital burn. The sight of the Republic and the Jedi Order on their knees was what Malgus had dreamed of for almost 30 years. However, his satisfaction had been stripped away from him. The first issue was that the Sith Empire accepted a Republic surrender. Malgus was left malcontented by this decision, as a fragile peace was vastly different to complete obliteration of his opponent. Despite how necessary the end of the war had been for the Sith Empire, it was not an outcome Malgus could stomach. Another thing he found difficult to reconcile was the realization that his political opponents, namely Darth Angral and his apprentice, Darth Adras, had used his wife against him during the sacking of Coruscant. Despite being a Sith, Malgus loved his wife truly and completely, an emotion he came to realize contradicted the Sith teachings he had been taught to believe in. And therein lay the problem. Alongside the Sith teachings Malgus had been exposed to at the Sith Academy, he had had other influences. His father's early lessons had stuck with the Sith, and through the lens of his father's wisdom, Malgus came to see all the flaws in the Empire. After the Treaty of Coruscant was signed, a Cold War brewed between the Republic and the Sith Empire. For the next 20 years, Malgus served the Empire's governing body, the Dark Council, undertaking several missions for the Empire. Amongst others, he ordered the destruction of Hammer Station, located the Foundry, commissioned a superweapon for the Dark Council, and led expansive expeditions into the unknown regions. But more importantly, Malgus made allies. You see, Malgus was an unconventional Sith. He hired many alien mercenaries, and through his dealings with them, learnt about their languages and culture. He created diplomatic ties with the Voss and the Chiss, both of whom saw him favorably. Because Malgus, unlike the Sith, didn't believe in humanocentrism. For most of its history, the Sith Empire drew a hard line. Humans were the superior species, and all alien races were to be nothing more than slaves. But that wasn't the only core Sith belief Malgus challenged. As he slowly built his power base, Malgus couldn't help but notice how the Sith's petty hatreds and power struggles did more harm than good. The Sith's greatest enemy was themselves as they vied for power, destabilizing the Empire. He also took grave issues with the Empire's deification of the Sith Emperor. Thanks to a series of dark side rituals, Vitiate was still the Dark Lord of the Sith, but in Malgus's eyes, he did nothing for his empire. The Emperor had been absent for a very long time, leaving the running of his empire to the Dark Council. Worse still, during the Cold War, a Jedi strike team managed to infiltrate the Citadel and kill him, allegedly. All these factors put together only increased Malgus's disillusionment with the Sith Empire, which peaked near the end of the Cold War. Following the Jedi attack on the Citadel and the Sith Emperor's murder, Darth Aho, another member of the Dark Council, launched an invasion on the planet Ilum, aiming to control its rich supply of crystals. Malgus, however, had other plans. Instead of supporting his fellow Sith, Malgus aided the Republic counteroffensive, supplying valuable intelligence and ground support. This way, Aho was defeated, and Malgus could take his seat on the Dark Council and his sphere of military offense. As part of his role, he led Imperial missions to secure a steady supply of Adagan crystals, which he was intending to use to power the stealth generators of an armada of ships. While serving on the Dark Council, Malgus did try to effect change, rallying for alien advocacy and policy reforms within the Empire, but staunch Sith conservatives shot him down. This turned out to be somewhat of a mistake. From his position on the Dark Council, Malgus had amassed a wealth of resources. During his various assignments for the Empire, he had also gathered a number of allies, particularly among alien races. The moment his stealth armada had been completed, Malgus went full Chad and declared himself Sith Emperor. But Malgus' empire would be different. He envisioned an empire free of infighting and the petty squabbles that had weakened the Sith. With his allies, his stealth armada, and a droid army he had built to rival Revan's, he set out to purify the galaxy through war. Unlike other Sith before him, Malgus didn't reject others joining him. In fact, he welcomed those who had been as malcontent as he to join forces with him and realize their dream of a Sith empire stronger than ever before. With his army of Sith rebels, Malgus initially set out in the unknown regions, which he had ventured into on behalf of the Empire years ago. His army saw several early victories. With the Sith Emperor's death announced to the greater galaxy, many Sith turned to Malgus as the next obvious choice for a leader. Unfortunately for Malgus, the Republic and Sith Empire had a common enemy for once, and neither wanted a powerful and populist Sith Emperor on the throne. Malgus' army suffered a humiliating first defeat at Ilum. Then, a strike force infiltrated his space station, making its way through its defenses until they encountered Malgus in his new throne room. Although the fight was fierce, Malgus eventually lost. Rather than allowing himself to be killed, he set the space station to self-destruct and went out with a bang. However, as everyone knows, if the death isn't on screen, it ain't real, and that was the case with Malgus. For the better part of a decade, Malgus was presumed dead. Many events transpired throughout the galaxy. The Republic and Empire went back to poking at one another. They averted the Dread War. They were subjugated by the internal empire of Zakul, then eventually overthrew it. Over the years, many rumors circulated regarding Malgus' survival, and they were finally proven true at the onset of the Third Galactic War. Out of nowhere, Malgus appeared during the Empire's invasion of Ossus, revealing himself as the new Emperor's Wrath, a second to the then Sith Empress, Asina. It was a huge shock to the greater galaxy, but the Republic had little time to waste. The moment he appeared on Ossus, Malgus took command of the assault and personally led the attack on the Jedi colony, presided over by Jedi Master Nost Durol, forcing them to evacuate. After Ossus, Malgus set his sights on Dantooine, which he saw as a threat due to it bordering Sith space. Because of its location, it was not only an excellent staging ground for Republic attacks, but a great resupply point for the Republic's Outer Rim operations. As he had done before, Malgus hired mercenaries to storm the planet and take it by force, repelling the Republic. But Malgus' greatest hit was Corellia, specifically the advanced Republic shipyard known as the Meridian Complex. The shipyard was deemed key for a Republic victory, and so the Sith were hellbent on destroying it. Malgus and his ally, Darth Krovos, assembled a massive fleet and set course for Corellia. He took advantage of the Republic's lack of fuel ships, so he sent other teams to engage and destroy Republic reinforcement fleets at other key locations before they could come to Corellia's aid. Within the Meridian Complex, Malgus fought a group of Jedi and Republic sympathizers until an explosion knocked the station askew. The Republic teams escaped, but Malgus was left injured. Malgus was left aboard a medical ship where he had another vision that left him frightened. Seeking a remedy for his psychological state, he left for the abandoned Jedi Enclave on Dantooine. Within the Enclave, he learnt of Darth Null, an ancient Sith Lord who might be able to help him. His search led him to the Temple of Null on the planet Elom in search of a holocron. However, he found the Sith and Jedi had beaten him to it and were now fighting over the prize. Malgus interfered and eventually won the holocron, finally revealing his plan. He stated the Jedi and Sith left many young ones behind that they deemed unworthy and urged the Padawan to give him the holocron so they could find her brother. Although Malgus left with the holocron, he also left the Padawan alive to consider his words. Eventually, Malgus was defeated by a Republic strike force outside the temple and taken prisoner aboard Carrick Station, where he was contained in a special prison. Despite being a prisoner, Malgus seemed unbothered and vowed that the Republic's troubles were only beginning. What he had begun would only end with a galaxy in flames, and he, Malgus, would be the one fanning them. He would not stop until he had purged the galaxy of the corrupt and incompetent powers that governed it. And then he remained silent. Anyone who's played Star Wars The Old Republic would instantly recognize the Giga Chad Sith we're talking about today. In the past, we've talked about many different Sith, powerful sorcerers, world devourers, plague brewers, you name it. Something they all had in common was how they saw the galaxy as theirs to use for their own personal gain. They were power-hungry warriors and politicians who pursued their own selfish interests. Darth Marr was different. He was a Sith that looked beyond himself as an individual and saw a greater purpose. He had a sense of duty and loyalty no other Sith displayed. A Sith Lord of such motivation that he found enlightenment where few other Sith ever did. In today's video, we'll be discussing Darth Marr's impressive career, his ideals, and how he transcended beyond Sithhood. Few Sith Lords reached the level of power Darth Marr wielded in his lifetime. Born 3,702 years before the Battle of Yavin in the True Sith Empire, not much is known about Marr's early career. Those who knew the Sith Lord's history tactfully kept their mouths shut after he rose to power. What we do know is that he trained as a Sith warrior and adopted his iconic spiky armor with its faceless mask early on. It was said that no one had ever seen his face. Those who did not live to tell the tale. An iconic story is how he disciplined Moff Zerzian for failing to quell an uprising on the planet Solust. The Moff was summoned to his chambers and, after being dismissed, he submitted his resignation and unalived himself. The rumor was that Marr had removed his mask, which was such a traumatic experience that the Moff was driven to Sudoku. As a weapon, he wielded the legendary Tulak Horde saber after he recovered it on the planet Tremont Fels. In around 3681 BBY, near the beginning of the Great Galactic War, he took a seat on the Dark Council, the Sith Empire's ruling body. He was in charge of the sphere of defense of the Empire, which oversaw deploying the Imperial military to defend the Empire's territory from attack. During his time as a Dark Counselor, Marr participated in many high-ranking Sith operations. He was part of a team that took down the Sith Lord Califo and elevated his apprentice to the Dark Council. In 3660 BBY, he defended both Korriban and Ziost from Republic attack. He was known as the Counselor with the faceless mask that no Republic army could break. By the end of the Great Galactic War, he was one of only 7 Council members that survived the conflict. During the Cold War that followed, Marr, now the de facto leader of the Council, took to strengthening the Empire's defenses in preparation for the inevitable rekindling of war. At this time, Marr's only concern wasn't the increasing tension with the Republic. He focused heavily on controlling the infighting and treachery the Empire was infamous for, but he could only do so much while overseeing a gaggle of stroppy Sith children. Darth Barras and Darth Thanaton were both usurped by younger Sith after they attempted to seize power and were eventually killed. The Battle of Corellia also saw 3 Dark Council members dead. 2 of those were the heads of the spheres of military strategy and offense for the Empire, which meant that Darth Marr was now in complete control of the Imperial Army. Marr was left struggling to stabilize the Empire's leadership, especially since the remaining council members made his life difficult with their petty squabbles. His career, however, wasn't what made Darth Marr stand out as an exemplary Sith leader. What made Darth Marr such a legendary figure was his outlook on life and death, and his stalwart dedication to his duty. You see, unlike other Sith who only thought of themselves, Darth Marr was one of the rare few with a greater vision. He had devoted himself to protecting the Empire and its people, to securing its continuation and prosperity. To this end, he would not hesitate to do anything. To Darth Marr, warfare was a means to an end. He was a zealous believer that, through war, society and people evolved for the better, because, to him, the Empire was in dire need of adapting and evolving. The petty infighting that held their society back for centuries had come to a stop so they could become effective and grow stronger. While he was in control of the Empire's ruling body, he did all he could to stop the political squabbles and backstabbing to secure some level of stability for his people. That said, Marr was by no means a secret softie. He was still a ruthless Sith who wouldn't hesitate to force choke someone. The difference between him and other Sith, however, like his fellow counselor Ravage, was that he didn't haphazardly explode in violence. Rather than flaring out uncontrollably, Marr was the master of his own, with constantly simmering rage that he unleashed only when provoked. He didn't randomly lash out though. He valued competence and punished incompetence harshly. As a leader, he gave his all and expected the same from his subordinates. If they failed to perform their duties, he would not hesitate to kill them for their incompetence. Failure was never an option, nor was cowardice. Interesting to note was that, during the Cold War, Marr was actively dying. His immersion into the dark side had eroded his body and was killing him gradually. It wasn't just his body affected, however. Along his flesh, his ability to feel was also dwindling away until he could barely feel human emotions anymore. Marr didn't even fear death. He also had a unique outlook on life and duty, an excellent example of which could be seen in the way he treated his apprentice, Darth Plagueis, a capable warrior and politician in her own right. What made them an excellent team, however, was that she understood the bitter necessity of politics as much as her master did. She was his willing pawn, not because she had no choice, but because she understood he used his pieces strategically and not out of wanton stupidity like other Sith did. One example of their teamwork came during the Cold War when the governor of Balmorra was failing to control the planet. Deciding he needed to step in, Darth Marr dispatched his apprentice to take control of the situation. As we saw in the Prince of Power, he didn't just give his apprentice the role of mission lead. Instead, he took the time to caution her against foolish moves and to remind her that foresight is clearer the closer one is to death. To trigger a Force vision of her future, he dueled her until she was on the brink of death. Plagueis understood that he wouldn't hesitate to kill her if she proved weak, but she was determined to prevail. What she saw in her vision was her own death. Marr understood, but he still sent her off with this final message. You cannot escape death. Consider this my final lesson. Only a coward runs from the inevitable. You are not a coward, my apprentice. Those were his last words to his apprentice, and Plagueis understood enough to go willingly. Where every other Sith fought against their impending death, Marr embraced it as inevitable. This was, of course, in contrast to his very title. The title Darth was a perversion of the Rakatan phrase Dartar, which meant conqueror of death. He didn't let fear control him. Duty-bound to serve and defend the Empire, he was the truest leader the Empire ever had. His ideals were what helped him find enlightenment in the end. As we mentioned earlier, Darth Marr was loyal only to the Empire. He held no personal feelings toward other people or institutions. What he cared about was how useful they were, and if he judged them detrimental, they were discarded. That's why, when the Order of Revan attempted to resurrect the Sith Emperor in Yavin 4, Marr acted immediately to stop them. Vitiate, the former Sith Emperor, had proven his insanity many times over by this point. Allowing him to return and take control of the Empire would undo all the progress Marr had achieved. Not only did Marr fight against his old master, but he also teamed up with the Galactic Republic to do so. Unlike other Sith, Marr didn't think the Jedi were weak. On the contrary, he thought their Grand Master, Satil Shen, was the only Force user that could be considered his equal. Together, the Republic and Empire put a stop to Revan's plans and prevented the Emperor's resurrection. Unfortunately, the Empire returned anyway. On Ziost, he consumed almost every living being's life force and vowed to do the same to the rest of the galaxy. Again, Marr allied with Satil Shen to stop him. Soon after Ziost, Marr took a joint fleet into wild space where they believed Vitiate and his unknown allies were hiding. The Eternal Fleet, Bzakul's nigh indestructible army of superships, suddenly attacked them and boarded Marr's command ship during the space battle. Although Marr did his best to defend the bridge, it was soon determined that the ship was lost. He and the Outlander, who had led the joint forces against the Revanites, were taken captive, brought to Bzakul, and made to kneel in front of Vitiate. Instead of kneeling, however, Marr defied the Emperor one final time, stating he would never kneel to him. The Sith Lord attacked, killing several guards before the Emperor murdered him with Force lightning. That was not, however, the end of Darth Marr. Marr wouldn't be heard of from again until over half a decade later when the Alliance, an organization that came together under the Outlander to fight Bzakul, came to Odessen. The former Outlander, now Alliance commander, wandered through the planet's forest, sensing a familiar presence. There, they came across a camp where they found none other than Satil Shan and Darth Marr. The Jedi Grandmaster had gone into a self-imposed exile, while Marr was actually manifesting as a Force ghost. He had sought her out so they could discuss what had happened and reach some kind of mutual understanding. He revealed that he had lingered behind because he felt guilt for abandoning the Empire. In true Marr fashion, he remarked that his stubbornness on Zakuul had led to his death. Although he did not regret dying, he regretted abandoning his people when they needed him the most. That was why he reached out to Satil. Together, the two had spent years discussing the Force and learning about each other's philosophies. This was to discover what made the Zakuulan Force users so much more powerful than either of their orders. Their conclusion was that the Zakuul Knights did something neither the Jedi nor the Sith did. They didn't focus on the dark or the light side, but rather a balance between both. It was in this balance, walking along the edge, that true power lay. This was the lesson the two legendary warriors had wanted to pass on to the commander in hopes they would use it to kill Vitiate. As an out-of-universe note though, this is what Marr said, but it wasn't accurate. The Zakuulans were Darksiders who didn't embody the light side. Even based off Marr's conclusion, what he was trying to say was that he had embraced the power of the light side as seen by his parting remark. In life, I dismissed the Jedi Code. I was wrong. There is no death. There is only the Force, and it has a plan. As we've covered in past videos, it's impossible to strike a true balance between dark and light. Nevertheless, what Marr accomplished during his time with Shan was nothing short of a miracle. Out of all the Sith, only Darth Marr and his drive to improvise, adapt, overcome could have ever reached this level of enlightenment and peace with the Force. Once the Emperor was defeated, Marr finally found peace and became one with the Force, his duty done. Duty, loyalty, self-reflection, adaptability. These were all things Darth Marr had that no other Sith displayed. Those were the reasons he could ally with the Jedi and why he could come to understand and embrace their perspective, crafting a unique outlook on life and the Force that brought strength to those who embraced it. More than any other Sith in the franchise, Darth Marr earned his peace and our respect. 3,637 years before the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy was in the middle of the galactic war between the Republic and the true Sith Empire. The Republic had been defeated by the Sith in the First Galactic War over a decade prior, but this time, things were looking up for the beleaguered government, as a Jedi strike force had managed to kill the Sith Emperor Darth Vitiate, crippling the Empire. But both the Republic and the Sith became distracted by reports of skirmishes on their borders with a new faction, one that neither of them had ever seen before. This new threat, the Eternal Empire, would go on to subjugate both galactic superpowers, and after just a few short months, it ruled the entire galaxy. In this video, we're going to be talking about this ancient threat to the Republic. The story of the Eternal Empire begins on a remote swamp world called Zakuul, an unremarkable planet in the far reaches of wild space. In the distant past, a forgotten group of humans settled on Zakuul, becoming a superstitious tribal people led by a trio of Force sensitives, the Matriarch, the High Shaman, and the Champion. In the beginning, they worshipped a pantheon of 6 deities called the Old Gods, who they believed took active roles in shaping their daily lives. These gods were Izaks, the ultimate destroyer, his wife, Saiva, and their 4 children, Tyth, Avala, Esna, and Nahut. These gods, they believed, fed on the pain and suffering of their followers. But prophecy spoke of a demon savior that would come to slay Izaks, casting down the old gods and ending the suffering of Zakuul. 3 centuries before the Galactic War, the spirit of Tenebrous, Lord of Many Faces, also known as Darth Vitiate, visited Zakuul and took over the body of a man named Valkorion. Dividing his spirit between Valkorion's body and the other puppet bodies he maintained back in the Sith Empire, Tenebrous declared himself the demon savior, uniting the nomadic tribes of Zakuul and rapidly reshaping them into an advanced civilization. Under Valkorion's rule, the people of Zakuul built the Spire, a massive pyramidal vertical city, the heart which was a vast star scraper that housed Valkorion's eternal throne.
Valkorion declared himself the immortal emperor of the Eternal Empire, an empire for which Zakuul would be the capital. Over the course of decades, he completely reshaped the society of Zakuul, forcing the Zakuulans to abandon the old ways and advance technologically. He also gathered up 4 sensitives of the planet which had previously served as tribe leaders, and formed them into the Knights of Zakuul, the elite personal servants of the Eternal Emperor. With the help of the Knights of Zakuul, Valkorion discovered the planet Lokath, a massive Dyson sphere in the unknown regions. Lokath was one of many unfathomably advanced creations of an ancient alien race, possibly the Celestials or one of their servant species. From there, he found the Eternal Fleet, an armada of advanced battle cruisers piloted by self-sufficient droids, the greatest creation of Lokath's builders. Valkorion's engineers found a way to enslave the Gemini, the droid masters of the Eternal Fleet, and the Eternal Throne became their new central control hub. With the Eternal Fleet under its control, the Eternal Empire became incredibly powerful and conquered a wide swath of wild space. After the hero of Tython, a champion of the Jedi Order, slew Darth Vitiad and his proxies during the Galactic War, the remains of Tenebrous' spirit fled the Sith Empire entirely. He came to view the Empire as a failed experiment, and the Empire rejected him in turn. He took Valkorion as his new permanent vessel and devoted his attention to the Eternal Empire. By that point, Valkorion had 3 children, all of whom had inherited some of Tenebrous' incredible strength in the Force. He kept his daughter, Vaylin, restrained, but his twin sons, Arkan and Thexan, became the commanders of the Eternal Empire's military. The twins longed to prove themselves to their father against the Republic and the Sith, and in 3637 BBY, Valkorion agreed. Thexan and Arkan fought many battles against both the Republic and the Sith, seeking their father's approval. When Valkorion seemed unimpressed by their exploits, Arkan was enraged and attacked him. Thexan defended Valkorion and was slain by his twin brother after a brief lightsaber duel. This won Arkan the approval of his father, who made him the sole commander of the Eternal Empire's military and endorsed his plan for the conquest of the galaxy. Shortly after this, Arkan captured 2 powerful Force sensitives in a campaign on the borders of the Eternal Empire, the Sith Lord Darth Marr and a being known only as the Outlander. When he brought them before Valkorion, Marr recognized that the Eternal Empire was led by the former Sith Emperor and, furious, attempted to slay Valkorion, only to be easily killed. Valkorion then offered the Outlander a high place in the Eternal Empire, sensing that the Force sensitive had incredible potential. This infuriated Arkan, however, who took the chance to attack his father. With the Outlander's help, he slew Valkorion, but the remains of Tenebrous' spirit simply passed into the Outlander. Fearing Tenebrous' return, Arkan promptly had the Outlander frozen in carbonite. He assumed the throne of the Eternal Empire and resumed his campaign against the galaxy, quickly subduing both the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic. For the next 6 years, the Eternal Empire ruled the galaxy by proxy, using the Eternal Fleet to levy massive tributes from the Sith and the Republic. But its rule over the galaxy didn't last. In 3630 BBY, the Outlander was released from Carbonite and promptly began a campaign against the Eternal Empire. Both the Republic and the Sith rallied to the Outlander's side, forming the Eternal Alliance. The Outlander eventually defeated Arkan aboard his flagship, causing the Eternal Emperor to abandon his throne and defect. His sister Vaylin then assumed control of the Eternal Empire, but the Eternal Alliance managed to cast her down as well. The Outlander took control of the Eternal Fleet and gave it to the Alliance, formally dissolving the Eternal Empire in the process. The Eternal Alliance promptly fractured, and the Republic and Sith resumed their endless war. The Eternal Empire is pretty unique as far as Star Wars factions go. Outside of Zakuul, virtually the entire Empire was automated. The Eternal Fleet was pretty much self-sufficient and entirely artificial, and the majority of the ground force Valkorion assembled was composed of Sky Troopers, a line of advanced battle droids. The sheer power of this automated fleet allowed the Eternal Empire to easily conquer a massive swath of space, but the nature of the Empire meant that, in the end, it dissolved just as easily. Once the Outlander had seized the Eternal Throne and divided up the automated fleet between the component factions of the Alliance, the Eternal Empire virtually ceased to exist, as Zakuul was all that really remained of it. Even Zakuul was highly automated by the time of the Galactic War. The government of the Eternal Empire was largely skeletal, consisting almost entirely of the royal family and their droid servants. The Zakuulans lived lives of idle comfort in the Spire, paying little heed to the outside galaxy. Aside from the royal family, the only organics in the entire Eternal Empire who really mattered were the conscripts in the military and the Knights of Zakuul, and the conscripts were almost entirely phased out after Arkan took the throne. The Knights of Zakuul, the Eternal Empire's resident order of Force Sensitives, were quite different from other Force Sensitive orders. They wore gold armor and used lightsaber pikes and personal energy shields in combat. The Knights had a harsh, legalistic philosophy which differed from the codes of both the Jedi and the Sith. They saw the Force as a tool to be used in the pursuit of justice, and nothing more. They claimed to have an allegiance to neither the light side nor the dark side, but in reality, their view of the Force as a tool and their focus on acquiring power put the Knights of Zakuul strictly in the dark side camp, even if they weren't as totally selfish as most Darksiders. The true strength of the Eternal Empire was its automated military. The Sky Troopers, the Eternal Empire's jetpack-equipped battle droids, were ahead of their time and resembled the Dark Troopers of the Galactic Empire more than anything from the old Sith Wars. The Eternal Fleet was a force to be reckoned with as well, as it could be used in a way that mimicked Jedi battle meditation. Despite being composed of thousands of warships, it could be simultaneously commanded by a single individual thanks to the advanced Gemini droids that operated it, allowing the whole fleet to perform devastating coordinated attacks. The warships that composed the fleet were larger and more heavily armed than most contemporary vessels, and they were all equipped with cloaking devices as well. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Eternal Empire, however, was how quickly it faded away. After its dissolution, it was quickly forgotten by the Republic and the Sith, and the story of Valkorion and the Emperors of Zakuul became just another chapter in the longer tale of the Great Galactic Wars. The Eternal Fleet, the backbone of the Empire, was completely destroyed a few months after the Empire's fall by a rogue AI made by the same species that had built the fleet in the first place. All that remained of the Eternal Empire was Zakuul, which quickly faded into obscurity. Its population largely moved off to other worlds, and by the time of the Clone Wars, no one had known where Zakuul even was for millennia. For centuries, the Dark Lords of the Sith waged war against the Republic and the Jedi Order, building monstrous empires that swept across the stars, bringing the galaxy to its knees again and again. But by the late 2000s BBY, that part of galactic history seemed long over. The last Sith Empire had fallen over 1,000 years before, and the Sith were believed to be all but extinct, reduced to a handful of scattered cults. In 2000 BBY, however, a lone ex-Jedi Master reopened the whole can of worms, starting 1,000 years of hell for the galaxy. His birth name was Phaneus, but history knew him as Darth Ruin, and in this video, we'll be telling his story. Phaneus was an Umbaran, and he was taken into the Jedi Order at an early age. He was incredibly strong in the Force and rose rapidly through the ranks of the Jedi Order, quickly attaining the rank of Jedi Master. In many ways, he was a lot like Dooku. He was strong, intelligent, charismatic, and held in high esteem by both the Jedi and the galaxy at large. But there was always something different about Master Phaneus, and everyone around him knew it. Many Jedi felt that he was unsettling, and he was a controversial figure within the Order, with some believing him to be trouble, and others seeing him as a genius who others only disliked because he thought outside the box. Most of all, Phaneus was controversial because of his philosophy of solipsism. Now, if you're unfamiliar with solipsism, it's a real-world philosophical tendency that argues that yourself is the only thing you can ever be certain is actually real. If you've ever heard the saying, "I think, therefore I am," that's essentially the foundation of the philosophy, as phrased by the solipsist René Descartes. Master Phaneus thought along more or less the same lines,
something the Jedi Council harshly reprimanded him for trying to teach on several occasions. Fannius's philosophy was ultimately incompatible with the Jedi Code, and when that became apparent to him, he left the Jedi Order. He was counted as one of the first of the Lost, later the Lost 20 after Dooku joined their number, as he was a master who left the Order peaceably over philosophical differences. Fannius set out to find new teachings to explore that would be compatible with his beliefs, traveling the galaxy in search of Force-centric groups. In particular, he was looking for the traces of an ideological tendency the Jedi believed to be all but extinct: the Sith. Before leaving the Order, Fannius stole a Sith holocron from the Jedi Temple, and from it, he learned the ways of the dark side. Truth be told, his solipsism meant that he was always on the path to the dark side, but after leaving the Jedi, he embraced it fully. It didn't take long for the teachings of the Sith to instill in him a desire for revenge against the Jedi for refusing to accept his teachings. To that end, he sought to resurrect the Sith and build a new empire of his own, with which he hoped to destroy the ones who had dared to reject him. On the fringes of Republic space, Fannius found a few scattered Sith cults, forgotten remnants left behind after the old Sith Wars, which he managed to infiltrate and unite under one banner. He did this in secret, with the Jedi completely unaware of what he was planning, which only strengthened his growing delusions of grandeur. At the same time, he travelled regularly back into the Republic to meet with his old Jedi friends, who he slowly began to corrupt to the dark side. They spread his heresies within the ranks of the Jedi Order, and in 2000 BBY, they struck. That year, Fannius took on the mantle of Darth Ruin and proclaimed himself the new Dark Lord of the Sith. The Sith cults he had gathered to his side revealed themselves, and 50 Jedi Knights declared allegiance to him. What started as 50 Dark Jedi grew to 100, and then even further. The Fourth Great Schism had begun. The Jedi Order was split between the followers of Darth Ruin and the followers of the Jedi Council, causing chaos all over the Republic. Jedi battled Jedi, and the Senate was paralyzed and powerless to intervene. Ruin and his followers declared themselves the new Sith, and attempted to establish a new Sith Empire out in the far reaches of Republic space. They and their followers began to wage war against the Republic as well, and the battle lines of the new Sith Wars were drawn. What makes Darth Ruin interesting, though, is his take on Sith ideology. Over the years, his solipsism evolved, going from being a simple philosophical pursuit to monomania. Darth Ruin didn't just believe that he couldn't prove that anyone apart from himself existed, he came to see himself as a superior being, and eventually as the only being to actually exist. Everything else, he believed, was a creation of his conscious mind that existed only for his benefit. This madness aligned nicely with the individualistic teachings of the Sith, which promoted selfishness in the extreme. Darth Ruin codified his philosophy in the Creed of Darth Ruin, an alternative to the Sith Code that he preached during his reign as Dark Lord of the Sith. The creed is as follows: there is no passion, there is solely obsession. There is no knowledge, there is solely conviction. There is no purpose, there is solely will. There is nothing, only me. Why people even follow this absolute lunatic is beyond us, but Sith are gonna Sith, I guess. It's unclear to what extent Ruin preached his creed to his followers, but some later members of the new Sith adhered to parts of his philosophy, such as Darth Revan and Lord Daemon. Nonetheless, his influence defined 1,000 years of Sith to come, as the new Sith were defined by being more extreme in their individualism and self-serving tactics than the old Sith had been. The Sith dynasty that Ruin found was fractious and tactically bankrupt, but it was also ruthless, relentless, and it spawned a long line of monomaniacs hell-bent on seizing as much power as possible. The details of Darth Ruin's life after the start of the new Sith Wars are practically non-existent, but we do know that he attempted to build an empire and conquered sizable chunks of the Outer Rim. His new Sith would go on to trouble the Republic and Jedi in 1,000 years of constant war, which would eventually bring the entire galaxy to the brink of complete civilizational collapse. But Darth Ruin didn't live to see much of the new Sith Wars. Despite being one of the most important Sith Lords in history, his reign as Dark Lord of the Sith was actually very short. As you might expect, he had nobody to blame for that but himself. Because Darth Ruin believed that he was the only thing in the universe that was actually real, he treated his followers really badly. He was notorious for sacrificing the lives of his disciples at a whim and never showing anyone the slightest hint of respect or gratitude, believing his followers to be non-existent, mere manifestations of his conscious mind. Ruin's followers, being Sith themselves, really didn't appreciate this treatment, and it didn't take long for a group of them to band together and assassinate him. Ruin never saw it coming. He never even thought to consider that another being could ever kill him. When Darth Ruin died, his would-be empire fractured as his assassins fought each other over who would get to be the next Dark Lord of the Sith. The new Sith splintered into many factions and they would remain divided for over 900 years. But the new Sith would survive despite this internal conflict, and they would continue to make constant, uncompromising war against the rest of the galaxy. A war they steadily began to win. In that time, many claimed the title of Dark Lord of the Sith, seeking to lay claim to Darth Ruin's legacy, and many would suffer a similar fate as he did, slain by their own followers in a power grab. Darth Ruin was one of the most unique Dark Lords of the Sith. He wasn't just a vicious conqueror or an arrogant schismatic, he was the embodiment of power hunger and selfishness. And some Star Wars authors consider him to be the embodiment of pure evil. As a last out-of-universe note, Darth Ruin was actually who George Lucas thought of as the first Sith Lord. His story was based on an old manuscript Lucas made while writing the films detailing the history of the Sith, adapted to fit in with later expanded universe works. We've told the stories of many Dark Lords of the Sith on this channel, all of whom were unique and interesting in their own way. But there's one obscure Sith Lord that stands out from the rest, mostly because he was a ghost. This enigmatic character was known as the Dark Underlord, and he led a faction of Sith during the tumultuous New Sith Wars, wreaking havoc across the Republic before he was destroyed by a Jedi Master. In this video, we'll be telling the story of this most mysterious Dark Lord of the Sith. Who exactly the Dark Lord originally was is uncertain, and not even the Sith who served him knew how he returned to the world of the living. Stories say that he was a spirit of a great Darksider of old, freed from chaos, the hell to which the servants of darkness were banished, by a Sith acolyte. Some said he was one of the Dark Lords of old, others claimed him to be the reincarnation of Zendor, the leader of the Legions of Leto, the first Dark Jedi to rebel against the Order. But whoever the Dark Underlord originally was, he was powerful, and upon returning to the world of the living, he soon became the Dark Lord of the Sith. His rise happened in approximately 1750 BBY, 2.5 centuries after the start of the New Sith Wars. These were a cataclysmic series of conflicts that ravaged the Republic during the Dragulch period, a time of chaos and terror in which the Republic was brought to its knees for the gazillionth time, and much of the galaxy was under the control of students of the dark side. The wars began with the rise of Darth Ruin, a Jedi renunciate who sparked a fourth great schism in the Jedi Order. Ruin joined his Dark Jedi with the scattered remnants of the old Sith to form the new Sith, which attempted to rebuild the Sith Empire of old. But Darth Ruin's reign was a short one. His students were jealous of his power and killed him, trying to usurp control of the Sith. Ruin's would-be empire splintered and the new Sith became fractious and chaotic, a tenuous alliance of cults and petty realms that battled each other as much as they did the Jedi and the Republic. But their patchwork empire steadily expanded, dealing the Republic defeat after defeat. And by the Dark Underlord's time, the new Sith controlled large swaths of the Outer Rim. But they were still a disorganized bunch with many claimants to the title of Dark Lord, and over the 1,000-year course of the New Sith Wars, they only united when one claimant was strong enough to overcome all the others. The Dark Underlord was the first since Darth Ruin to achieve this. The Dark Underlord assembled a legion of Sith followers, known to history as the Black Knights, gathering them at a fortress on the Outer Rim planet of Malrev 4. a large portion of the new Sith united under the banner of the Black Knights. The number of the Dark Underlord's followers is unknown, but he seems to have had quite a large army, led in part by a Zeltron Sith general. From their base on Malrev 4, they began a campaign of terror that spread across the Outer Rim, threatening the Republic's control of the entire region, which was already tenuous thanks to centuries of Sith activity and the slow implosion of Republic bureaucracy. During the Black Knight's rampages, the Dark Underlord was known for leading his followers from the front, personally slaying many Jedi over the years. He favoured the dual-bladed Jarkai combat style, but he opted to use alchemically enhanced Sith swords instead of lightsabers, preferring the viscerality of the weapons to the more conventional Sith lightsaber. This might provide a clue toward the Dark Underlord's origins, as most of the ancient Sith Lords of the Sith Empire also preferred swords to lightsabers, as exemplified by Marka Ragnos, Naga Sadow, and Ludo Kressh. This could also suggest that the Dark Underlord predated the lightsaber altogether and was from a time when such swords were mainstream among the Jedi, which lends credence to the Zendor theory. Very little about the Dark Underlord himself is known, apart from the carnage he wrought and his seemingly all-consuming bloodthirst. His power and lust for battle made him and his followers devastating opponents, and the Republic and Jedi struggled to contain the Black Knight's offensive. The Underlord's followers terrorized the Zonamiki hyperspace route, pillaging space stations and Republic colonies wherever they went. They seemingly made no effort to establish an empire or hold any territory, instead waging a purely destructive war. Nonetheless, they did serious damage to the Republic. The campaign of the Black Knights was the beginning of a centuries-long period in which the Republic would slowly be driven back to the core before all but ceasing to exist. The Black Knights' efforts were likely concentrated in the northern Outer Rim, where Malrev 4 was located. Even if that wasn't the case, they undoubtedly caused trouble in the area as they managed to alienate the Mandalorians, whose territory was just across the Hydian Way from Malrev 4. This was the Dark Underlord's biggest mistake, and it provided the Jedi and the Republic a much-needed opportunity to defeat the Black Knights. After a few years of the Black Knights' rampages, the Jedi Council assigned one of their greatest commanders, a Jedi Master named Murtagh, the task of finding a way to defeat the Dark Underlord. Murtagh appears to have had an axe to grind with the Black Knights, but the nature of this grudge and his special fixation with defeating the Dark Underlord is unknown. Regardless, in seeking to destroy the Dark Underlord, Murtagh forged an alliance that few Jedi would have dared to even consider. An alliance with the Mandalorians. Some Jedi would have tried to appeal to the Mandalorians' sense of honor to get them to join the fight against the Dark Underlord. Others would have promised them a glorious battle against a worthy enemy. Murtagh's approach to recruiting the Mandalorians was much simpler. He offered them a ton of credits to go to war on his behalf. The Mandalorians, being practical, took the job. They even committed some of their most prized weapons to the fight, a kind of powerful tank known as the Mandalorian Battle Harness, and some Lagatos war dragons, the degenerated descendants of the Basiliskans, a tough, dragon-like species who had reverted to an animal-like state after millennia of being held as slaves by the Mandalorians. Murtagh's plan was simple. The Mandalorians, supported by the Republic military and a team of Jedi Knights, would lead an all-out assault on the Dark Underlord's fortress on Malrev 4. Their attack would draw out the Black Knights, whom Murtagh expected to commit fully to the battle. After the Mandalorians drew the Black Knights out, Murtagh himself would infiltrate the fortress while the Dark Underlord was distracted and assassinate him. It wasn't a very Jedi-like plan, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Murtagh's plan worked. The Black Knights took the bait and were trounced by the Mandalorians, who killed the Dark Underlord's top general in battle. Meanwhile, Murtagh confronted the Dark Underlord and after a lengthy battle, succeeded in destroying him. The Dark Underlord's spirit either returned to chaos or was destroyed, but his defeat wasn't the decisive victory the Jedi had hoped for. Murtagh fell to the dark side during his confrontation with the Underlord, and in the years that followed, he himself became a leader of the new Sith. Additionally, the Black Knights survived the death of their leader and their defeat at the hands of the Mandalorians. The group would see several resurgences over the course of the New Sith Wars, returning again and again to wreak havoc in the rapidly shrinking Republic. The Republic victory in the Battle of Malrev 4 would prove to be only a temporary setback for the new Sith, whose ravages would only worsen in the centuries to come. The Dark Underlord's leadership was lost, but new Dark Lords rose up to replace him, and his legacy lasted for hundreds of years. His Black Knights even survived the end of the New Sith Wars, which wiped out the Sith Lords almost entirely. Over 2 centuries after the Battle of Ruusan, the Black Knights saw a resurgence in the Fluhaka Revolt before they were defeated for good by a Padawan named Yoda.
2 there should be, no more, no less. 1 to embody the power, 1 to crave it. This was the original version of the Rule of 2, a doctrine that changed the Sith forever after the cataclysmic end of the New Sith Wars. It was written by Darth Bane, one of the greatest Dark Lords of the Sith, and it sought to correct the fatal flaw that had afflicted all Sith orders here too. When more than 2 Sith Lords got together, they had a nasty habit of destroying themselves. Many of you have likely heard of Darth Bane, but few know much about him apart from the changes he made to the Sith. In this video, we'll be telling the full story of this mysterious visionary. 1026 years before the Battle of Yavin, during the Dark Age of the Republic, a man named Dessel was born in Apatros, a poor mining planet in the Outer Rim. His mother died in childbirth, and he spent his first 18 years being raised by his father, who was violently abusive and blamed Dessel for the death of his mother. He believed his own son was the bane of his existence, to the point that he eventually took to simply calling him Bane. His father, like just about everyone on Apatros, worked in the planet's cortosis mines, doing some of the nastiest labor the galaxy had to offer to supply lightsaber-resistant cortosis to the Republic, a metal that was in high demand due to the ongoing New Sith Wars. When Dessel was 16, he joined his father in the mines, where the other miners often joined in bullying him. One day, after enduring 2 years of this hell, Dessel decided to stand up to his father, who then beat him within an inch of his life in a drunken rage. That night, as the pain kept him from sleeping, Dessel's mind was consumed by thoughts of revenge, crushing his father's heart. When the next day dawned, he found his father dead. Unbeknownst to him, Dessel had drawn on the dark side of the Force for the first time, but not the last. After a further 5 years on Apatros, Dessel managed to convince a friend to smuggle him off-world. Having developed a hatred of the Republic over the course of his time in the mines, he enlisted in the ground armies of Lord Khan's Brotherhood of Darkness, the current incarnation of the new Sith. Dessel was quickly recognized as one of the Brotherhood's best soldiers, and it wasn't long before he was noticed by the Sith Lords, who realized that he was Force sensitive. Sensing great potential within the young man, Lord Kopech, one of the reigning Dark Lords of the Brotherhood, invited Dessel to come train at the Sith Academy on Korriban. Dessel accepted, and as was customary for the Sith, he chose a new name for himself. Having been taught by Lord Kopech that his anger and hatred were the source of his strength, he chose the name that his abusive father had branded him with years before: Bane. On Korriban, Bane rapidly surpassed the other students at the Sith Academy, despite discovering his talent in the Force relatively late. With the help of Blade Master Qasim and the fallen Jedi Githany, Bane learned a wide variety of lightsaber and Force techniques, and his extensive studies of the Academy's archives brought him extensive knowledge of the history and ideology of the Sith. All this allowed him to best several of his rivals at the Academy, but it also instilled him with doubts about the Brotherhood of Darkness. Studying the history of the Sith led Bane to believe that Lord Khan had perverted the Sith teachings and warped the Sith into a dark mirror of the Jedi Order, putting the Brotherhood's stability before the demands of the dark side. An expedition to the Valley of the Dark Lords, in which Bane sensed that the spirits of the ancient Sith had abandoned Korriban, only confirmed these beliefs in his eyes. When Bane returned from the valley, he learned that Khan had ordered that all the students on Korriban were to be promoted to the rank of Dark Lord and sent to Ruusan to join the Ruusan campaign. But Bane rejected the call, Instead, he travelled to Lehon, where he sought out the Temple of Ancients, the former stronghold of Darth Revan. There, he felt the dark side was much stronger in the Academy on Korriban, and in the temple's catacombs, he stumbled upon Revan's Sith holocron. From Revan's holocron, Bane learned a vast array of Sith teachings and techniques, allowing him to finalize his rule of two, the beginning of a new take on Sith teachings. Seeing Bane as a potential threat, Lord Khan sent Qas-Im to kill Bane on Lehon, but Bane was able to best the Blade Master in combat. Khan tried again by sending Githany, who had been in a relationship with Bane at the Academy, to kill him on Umbria, a world that had once been strong in the dark side, though the ancient Jedi had long ago contained the planet's taint to Lake Nath. Bane met Githany at the shores of this lake, where she poisoned him with a kiss, nearly succeeding in killing the would-be Dark Lord. But Bane was able to keep himself alive long enough to track down a healer living on the planet, a man named Caleb, whom he blackmailed into curing him by threatening to murder his daughter. Bane then travelled to Ruusan, where he joined the Brotherhood at their camp. In front of the assembled Sith Lords, Bane claimed the ancient title of Darth, which Khan had forbidden the use of for fear of disunity. Khan was forced to tolerate this, however. His previous attempts to kill Bane had failed, and he knew that any others would as well. What's more, Bane came to the Brotherhood with a plan to win the coming 7th Battle of Ruusan. At his direction, the Sith assembled on a hilltop and unleashed the raw power of the dark side on their Jedi enemies, incurring mass casualties. But Khan and the others broke the ritual early, deciding to finish off the Jedi with a conventional charge. A major mistake, as Jedi reinforcers intercepted the charge and routed the Brotherhood's armies. In the wake of this catastrophe, Bane determined that the Brotherhood was beyond redeeming. The Sith, he believed, needed to start over entirely. In the aftermath of the 7th battle, Bane taught Lord Khan one of the techniques he had learned from Revan's holocron, the Thought Bomb, which would consume and imprison the souls of all within a broad blast radius, the users included. Khan, by this point, was beginning to lose his mind, and he was deluded enough to believe that he and the remaining Sith Lords would be strong enough to survive a Thought Bomb's detonation. While Bane fled a safe distance away, the remaining Sith Lords carried out the ritual and committed mass suicide, taking 100 of their Jedi foes with them. Darth Bane was left the last surviving Sith Lord, now free to remake the Order as he saw fit. While wandering the now abandoned battlefields of Ruusan, Bane stumbled upon a 10-year-old girl who called herself Xana. Sensing deep anger and hatred within her, as well as strength in the Force, Bane took her as his apprentice under the rule of two. For the next 10 years, the two lived in a camp on Umbria, where Bane raised Xana in the ways of the Sith, only rarely leaving the planet to hunt down Sith artifacts and teachings. While on Umbria, Bane developed a Sith grand plan, a plot to destroy the Republic and Jedi Order from the inside, which he would spend the rest of his life slowly bringing to fruition. 10 years after the 7th Battle of Ruusan, the Jedi discovered that Bane was still alive. They sent out a team of 5 Jedi to hunt down and eliminate the Sith once and for all, and the Jedi cornered Bane and Xana on Tython, where they fought a fierce battle. The Sith ultimately killed all of their Jedi assailants, but Bane was critically wounded in the process. Not yet ready to take the mantle of Dark Lord, Xana brought him to Umbria, where she tracked down Caleb, the healer who had cured Bane years before. Caleb's daughter now lived off-world and couldn't be used as blackmail, but Xana managed to convince Caleb to heal Bane again on the condition that she would turn herself and her master into the Jedi. Xana contacted the Jedi Temple and told them that Bane was on Umbria, which convinced Caleb to save Bane's life once more. Xana then killed the healer and used the dark side to drive another man mad, giving him Bane's lightsaber and setting him up to be discovered by the Jedi. As the team from Tython was dead, none of the Jedi knew what Bane looked like, so they fell for this ruse. They killed the madman and assumed that the Sith were no more. In this manner, the Jedi learned of Darth Bane and the rule of two, but they falsely believed that Bane had died before he could take his first apprentice. With the Jedi no longer looking for them, Bane and Xana left Umbria behind them, venturing out into the wide galaxy. Bane discovered that Lord Cordus, the master of the Korriban Academy, had kept a bank account with the IGBC full of funds embezzled from the Brotherhood, which he laid claim to. He and Zannah then moved to Seotric 4, where they lived for years as a pair of wealthy merchants. At their mansion on Seotric, they amassed a great collection of Sith lore and artifacts. During their time on Seotric, Bane completed Zannah's training and began waiting for the day she would attempt to usurp the title of Dark Lord of the Sith. But even after 10 years on Seotric 4, Zannah never made a move against Bane, leaving the Dark Lord to believe she was waiting for him to get old and weak, thus defeating the purpose of the Rule of Two. Infuriated by his apprentice's hesitancy to kill him, Bane sought out the holocron of Darth Andedu, an ancient Sith Lord who was rumored to have learned how to live forever. From Andedu's holocron, Bane learned the technique of essence transfer, which allowed him to steal the body of another if his will was strong enough to drive out its original consciousness. He planned to take Zannah's body and then find a new apprentice, allowing him to live indefinitely without weakening. Before he could confront Zannah, Bane was captured by a Force-sensitive Iktochi known only as the Huntress, who delivered him to the princess of the planet Doan. The princess was none other than Caleb's daughter, Serra, who had never forgotten Bane and wanted to torture him to death for killing her father. Bane managed to escape her prison, and as he fled Doan, he recruited the Huntress to be his new apprentice. Naming her Darth Cognus, Bane pursued Serra to Umbria, where Cognus slew the princess to claim her place at Bane's side. On Umbria, Bane once more came face to face with Darth Zannah, who challenged him to a duel to the death. Zannah believed that Bane's pursuit of essence transfer was a rejection to the Rule of Two. She accused him of being afraid of death and trying to rule the Sith forever. The two Sith fought a vicious duel, but Zannah had the advantage thanks to her mastery of Sith sorcery. Desperate, Darth Bane tried to use essence transfer to take over Zannah's body, but Zannah's will proved stronger than his, and Darth Bane was destroyed. Darth Zannah became the new Dark Lord of the Sith, and she took Darth Cognus as her apprentice. In a recent set of videos, we told the stories of Darth Bane and Darth Zannah, the first Sith Lords under Bane's Rule of Two. They were the beginning of a line of Sith that lasted for 1,000 years, ultimately ending with Darth Sidious. Most of the Baneite line is entirely unknown. We only know the names of a few Dark Lords that ruled between the time of Darth Zannah and the time of Darth Tenebrous, the master of Darth Plagueis. But there is one interesting story from this long unknown period that we're going to tell today. The story of Zannah's apprentice, Darth Cognus, and her first student, who broke away from the Sith to found his own order of Darksiders. For those who need a refresher or haven't seen our videos on Bane and Zannah, Darth Cognus was originally an Iktochi assassin known as the Huntress, who used her people's natural gift of precognition to hunt down her targets. These precognitive talents were amplified by the Huntress's untrained Force sensitivity, such that she not only received brief glimpses of the future, but full-fledged visions, and sometimes even visions of a target's past. She also had another unique ability, one that she put to use when hunting Force sensitives. She could project a sort of Force dampening field, masking her presence in the Force and hampering the ability of others to use the Force. These traits allowed her to be one of the most successful assassins of her time, able to easily hunt and kill Jedi, which she did on several occasions. In 980 BBY, she even managed to capture Darth Bane as part of a contract from the princess of the planet Doan, a contract that would change her life forever. For, at the time, Darth Bane was looking for a new apprentice, and after he escaped the princess's prison, he recruited the Huntress for the job. Eager to learn the ways of the Sith, she took the name Darth Cognus and pledged herself to be Bane's apprentice. But before Cognus's training could begin, Bane was confronted by his current apprentice, Darth Zannah, whom Bane wanted Cognus to replace. On Umbria, Zannah challenged Bane for the title of Dark Lord, and as Cognus watched from the sidelines, the two Sith fought a duel to the death, from which Darth Zannah emerged triumphant. Now the Dark Lord of the Sith, She took Cognus as her apprentice, using the example of her defeat of Darth Bane as Cognus's first lesson. A lesson in the nature of the rule of two. The story of Cognus's training under Darth Zana is entirely unknown, and what Cognus was like as a Sith Lord is also a bit of a mystery. However, based on her existing abilities and the name she chose for herself, it can be surmised that she, like Darth Zana, focused more on arcane, typically mind-affecting force abilities over more overtly aggressive ones. Eventually, Darth Cognus became stronger than her master and killed her, claiming the title of Dark Lord of the Sith for herself. Adhering to the rule of two, Darth Cognus took an apprentice not long after overthrowing Darth Zana. For her apprentice, she selected a three-eyed human mutant who, like herself, had a particular gift for precognition. She named this apprentice Darth Millennial. No, we're not kidding, that's his real name, and trained him in the ways of the Sith, passing on many dark side techniques. Darth Millennial initially showed promise as he was quite skilled in the use of the dark side, but nonetheless, Cognus soon started to question whether he had been the right choice for an apprentice. This wasn't due to any lack of ability on Millennial's part, but rather because he insisted on questioning just about every precept Cognus taught him. In particular, Millennial and Cognus clashed repeatedly over one point of contention: the rule of two. Darth Cognus, like Darth Zana before her, wholeheartedly agreed with Darth Bane's take on Sith philosophy and sought to uphold the rule of two and the Sith grand plan. Darth Millennial, meanwhile, disagreed with the rule of two. He preferred the rule of the strong, the philosophy of Lord Khan, the founderhood of the Brotherhood of Darkness. Despite the many self-evident failings of the Brotherhood and the new Sith, Darth Millennial was of the opinion that there should be many Sith, just as there had been before the 7th Battle of Ruusan. Darth Cognus repeatedly explained to him why he was wrong and why this approach to the Sith was unsustainable, but Millennial refused to listen, insisting on a return to how the Sith had been before Darth Bane came along. Eventually, Darth Cognus got sick of Millennial's nonsense and excommunicated him from the Order of the Sith Lords. She recruited a new apprentice who had more sense and eventually continued the line of Bane according to the rule of two. Darth Millennial, meanwhile, ran away and hid out on Dromund Kaas, recognizing that he didn't stand a chance if he tried to challenge Cognus for the title of Dark Lord. Dromund Kaas had once been the capital of the true Sith Empire, but by Millennial's time, it had been reduced to an uninhabited swamp dotted with ruined cities and abandoned temples. Millennial settled in one of the temples where he spent years contemplating the dark side and the teachings of Lord Khan. Millennial ultimately syncretized his own beliefs, the teachings of Lord Khan, and the writings of pre-Republic philosophers Dark Ramis and Plaristes to create his own philosophy, the Dark Force religion. Millennial's teachings were based around the idea that the light side and dark side were both illusions, and there was only the Force and those who had the strength of will to use it to the fullest extent. Of course, the tenets of the Dark Force also proclaimed that Darth Millennial was an innately superior being, a supreme prophet chosen by the Force itself to bring the truth to the galaxy. Millennial built a cult around his Dark Force religion, Prophets of the Dark Side, the members of which pretty much worshipped Millennial as the supreme prophet. Most of the members of this cult were, to put it mildly, easily deluded morons, but there were a few who joined Millennial that were genuinely intelligent and strong in the dark side, whom Millennial recruited from other non-Sith orders of Darksiders. The Prophets of the Dark Side focused on, you guessed it, honing their powers of precognition, and they made a great many prophecies over the course of Millennial's lifetime. Darth Millennial eventually died, but the Prophets of the Dark Side outlived him. They remained cloistered in their fortress on Dromund Kaas for the most part, but now and again they ventured out into the greater galaxy, recruiting new disciples and, occasionally, establishing satellite facilities, such as their secondary fortress on Calicar 6, which they established in 100 BBY, and other fortresses on the planet Bosthurda. For the most part, the Prophets of the Dark Side were entirely insignificant in the grand scheme of things, until they were discovered by Darth Sidious. Sidious came to Dromund Kaas sometime before the Clone Wars and secretly recruited the Prophets to his cause, using them to foresee threats to his plans. During the Clone Wars, the Prophets of the Dark Side also assisted Asajj Ventress during the Battle of Dromund Kaas, in which their precognitive abilities gave Ventress the information she needed to outmaneuver and defeat the 327th Star Corps. After the rise of the Empire, the Prophets of the Dark Side came out of hiding, joining Sidious's empire as one of many groups of Darkseid-affiliated servants to the Sith. From there, the history of the Prophets of the Dark Side gets extremely messy, and the legacy of Darth Millennial was eventually lost entirely, though his name was invoked by fellow three-eyed human mutant Triculus when he tried to claim the title of Emperor after Sidious's death at Endor. But that's getting pretty deep into the weeds of the expanded universe, so we're going to spare you and end our account of Millennial's legacy there.
Fans of many franchises, Star Wars included, have a tendency to argue about characters' power levels. This is something we personally aren't too interested in, but as it's an inevitability in the fandom, we might as well set the record straight now and again. Usually, power level arguments are about which characters are the strongest, but today, we're going to be considering the alternative. This video is going to be about the weakest Sith Lord in the history of the Star Wars universe, a little known man by the name of Darth Gravid. After the 7th Battle of Ruusan, Darth Bane founded the Order of the Sith Lords, bringing the Sith back to their roots in an attempt to make them stronger. As part of this new order, Bane decreed that there would only be 2 Sith Lords, a master to embody the power and an apprentice to crave it. This was in stark contrast to earlier Sith orders, which had many Sith Lords and indeed many Sith who weren't Lords at all, such as assassins or marauders. But Bane did away with all of that. Rightfully, he thought that it weakened the Sith as a whole. The dark side of the Force, he once wrote, was like venom. The more vessels it is spread among, the weaker it becomes. The Order of the Sith Lords concentrated the venom of the dark side in the smallest possible number of vessels, making each individual Sith Lord as strong as humanly possible. If the dark side was like venom, then Darth Gravid's apprentice must have been extremely potent, because Gravid was anything but. We don't know all that much about him, but what we do know is enough. As Dark Lord of the Sith, he nearly cocked up the whole Sith Grand Plan, and not by accident either. His weak will and poor choices may well have saved the Republic were it not for Darth Gian, his young apprentice. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Somewhere around 600 BBY, the man who would become Darth Gravid was recruited by the reigning Dark Lord of the Sith as an apprentice. He was taught all of the dark side's many techniques and became knowledgeable in the lore of the Sith. He was also informed of Darth Bane's Sith Grand Plan. In time, he, like many Sith Lords before him, slew his master and claimed the title of Dark Lord for himself. He found his own apprentice, a young Twi'lek, who he gave the name Darth Gian. Together, they built a fortress on the planet of Jaguda, an ancient Sith world that had been rendered desert and abandoned for thousands of years prior. There, Gravid gathered all of the various Sith artifacts and tomes the Order had collected over the years, which had been passed down from master to apprentice since the death of Darth Bane. Gravid was intimately familiar with all of this lore, which included some of the last remaining written or holographic instructions for the practice of certain darkside powers. Thousands of years of Sith knowledge were sealed within Gravid's vaults for safekeeping. But Gravid wasn't only concerned with Sith lore. The ultimate goal of the Sith was the destruction of the Jedi Order, and so he acquainted himself with the Jedi lore as well, reasoning that he and his apprentice had to know what they were up against. That was essentially how Gravid spent most of his time as a Dark Lord. Where other Sith would have spent their years steadily weakening the Republic and the Jedi Order, Gravid simply studied the Jedi and sent Darth Gian out to do whatever he believed needed doing. That's pretty lackluster as it is, but it gets worse. As Darth Gravid studied Jedi lore, he started to be drawn to it. He started making altruism and empathy major components of his practices and teachings, values that starkly contrasted with the ideology of the Sith. In time, he came to the conclusion that the Sith's sole reliance on the dark side was a weakness, and that, to succeed, the Sith had to adopt Jedi teachings. Ideologically, he became a sort of grey Jedi, or rather a grey Sith, and sought to remake the Order of the Sith Lords according to this framework. Darth Gravid evidently did not understand the Force.
there was only the light side and the dark side, or rather, there was only the Force as it was meant to be, and its perversion. You could either heed the will of the Force, as was the way of the light, or you could reject it, as was the way of the dark, and doing a little of both was not viable long term. The dark side was inherently corrupting, and just a little use of it would poison a whole being, even if they adopted a bit of light side into their Force diet. The two sides of the Force were irreconcilable, just as the Jedi and Sith were irreconcilable. In attempting to reconcile the two, Gravid drove himself mad. He also severely weakened himself. He wasn't the first to develop this foolhardy notion of a middle ground between light and dark. The ancient Jedi Order, for example, spent 10,000 years trying in vain to pursue that goal. Just like this failing led to the downfall of the Jedi Order, it destroyed Darth Gravid too. You see, despite his coming around to some aspects of Jedi philosophy, Gravid was still ultimately a Darksider, and this change in philosophy weakened his ability to use the Force as he had been trained to. The dark side was about imposing one's own will on the Force, but passion and strong motives were needed to accomplish this, and Gravid's philosophical crisis diminished his motivation, and thus his power. It's possible that Darth Gian, Gravid's apprentice, sensed this, and that this was how she knew something had gone wrong. Whether or not that was the case, she knew something was up. However, she didn't make any moves against Gravid right away, as she was still rather young and in the earlier stages of her training. But Gravid forced her hand. By 552 BBY, his madness progressed to the point where he came to believe that the only way to remake the Sith was to destroy them. Believing he would be able to guide the Order to a more successful path afterwards, he raised Force barriers around his fortress and began destroying the contents of its vaults. He resolved to purge all that remained of the old Sith teachings and set about destroying holocrons, artifacts, and books of lore in earnest. It should be noted that not even the Jedi went that far in fighting the Sith teachings. They preferred to preserve even Sith holocrons, albeit in heavily guarded vaults where they theoretically could do no damage. Fortunately for the Sith, Darth Gian wasn't going to stand for any of this. Despite still being a young apprentice, Gian broke through the Force barriers around the fortress and confronted her master, resolving to claim the title of Dark Lord early. She and her master fought one last duel with the fate of the Sith at stake. Gravid, apparently, still had a good bit of skill in him. He managed to cleave off a good chunk of Gaen's left side, removing her arm and chunks of her face and chest. Through the power of the dark side, Gaen survived this, and ultimately, Gravid's skill with the lightsaber couldn't save him. He had gotten so weak that Gaen, despite being disarmed, severely wounded and inexperienced, still managed to kill him and claim the title of Dark Lord. In doing so, she saved the Order of the Sith Lords and a good deal of Sith lore. Gravid's final defeat just goes to show how weak he had become. There was no way in hell a Sith Lord should have lost that fight after gaining such an advantage, and yet he did exactly that. He did nothing productive in his time as a Dark Lord, and with the Sith so numerically limited under the rule of 2, he was a huge waste of training. There had been Sith Lords in the past who had returned to the light, but never before had one suffered such an ideological collapse, and none before had become as weak as Gravid. Through prosthetic reconstruction, Darth Gian was able to completely recover from the wounds Gravid had dealt her, making the former Sith Lord's only lasting legacy the destruction of a bunch of Sith lore. This sent the Sith grand plan back centuries, as Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious later noted, and led to the disappearance of several ancient Sith powers and rites. The most notable loss was Darth Andadu's essence transfer techniques, which Sith Masters had used to attempt to cheat death by taking over their apprentices' bodies. Sith apprentices didn't particularly miss that power, though Sith Masters certainly did.
After the 7th Battle of Ruusan, the Sith were reorganized under Darth Bane's rule of 2, abandoning galactic conquest in favor of a long-term grand plan. Bane and his successors lived in hiding, slowly preparing for the fruition of their ultimate goal, the destruction of the Jedi Order. Not all Baneite Sith Lords had the same take on the Sith grand plan, however. While Darth Sidious, the Dark Lord of the Sith who got to execute Bane's plan, chose to carry out a genocide of the Jedi, some of Sidious's predecessors preferred a more subtle approach. One of them, Darth Tenebrous, didn't want to wipe out the Jedi at all. Instead, he planned to make them obsolete. In this video, we'll be telling his story. Sometime around 247 BBY, a Bith named Ruges Gnome was born. Gnome, like many Bith, was a natural genius skilled in a wide variety of scientific fields. Unbeknownst to everyone around him, however, he also had a strong connection to the Force. Most Bith Force sensitives were given to the Jedi to train, but for some reason, Gnome was not. Instead, he was found by the reigning Dark Lord of the Sith, a Twi'lek who took Gnome as an apprentice. Ruges Gnome became Darth Tenebrous, trained in the ways of the Sith, and began working toward the fruition of the Sith Grand Plan. Tenebrous and his master were powerful enough that eventually the Jedi Council was able to sense their presence in the galaxy, perceiving it as a darkness that was slowly warping the shape of the Force. This darkness signaled that the Sith Grand Plan was almost at fruition. Tenebrous' master had a very specific vision for how the Jedi were to be eradicated. He worked to create a virus that would sever a Jedi's connection to the Force, which would render the Order unable to stop the return of the Sith. However, this project was a failure. Despite years of work, Tenebrous and his master just couldn't make it work, and Tenebrous ultimately chose to take the plan in a different direction. He killed his master and claimed the title of Dark Lord sometime after 167 BBY. Like many Dark Lords before him, Tenebrous' first order of business after killing his master was to find an apprentice. Traditionally, the Sith just kind of wandered the galaxy and chose the first promising Force sensitive they encountered, letting the dark side of the Force guide them to their apprentices. Tenebrous, however, took a different approach. He found a pair of Muns living on Mygeeto, took blood tests from them, and determined that they could produce a child incredibly strong in the Force. Tenebrous paid them to hook up and have a kid, and when the resultant child was 5 years old, Tenebrous took custody of him. The child, born Hego Damask, became Darth Plagueis. Darth Plagueis proved to be very strong in the Force, and when he came of age, he became very wealthy too. Plagueis' father, Kar Damask, was the chairman of the intergalactic banking clan, and when he died, Plagueis gained control over his late father's wealth and business connections. Part of his inheritance was the Moon of Sojourn, the remote location of a fortress-like estate that became Plagueis and Tenebrous' base of operations. Plagueis' wealth and connections were added to a vast pool of resources the Sith had been gathering since Darth Bane. From his master, Tenebrous had inherited a vast network of agents, a whole lot of credits, and access to the highest circles of galactic politics. Tenebrous had also done pretty well for himself in his public life. As Ruges Gnome, Tenebrous had become a master shipwright, building some of the most well-crafted starships in the galaxy. Tenebrous only sold his ships to the galaxy's elites, earning him easy influence over virtually any powerful being in the galaxy. He used his proceeds from shipbuilding to fund many other business ventures, some meant to generate even more revenue and connections, and others to serve his vision of the Sith Grand Plan. Tenebrous' version of the Grand Plan was far removed from any other known Sith Lords. Tenebrous and Plagueis were rationalists in their approach to the Force. In a sense, they were almost atheistic, seeing the Force as an exotic sort of energy driven by biological processes, not as anything mystical or sentient. To them, the study of the dark side was just another kind of science that allowed them to achieve incredible power. As a result, unlike most other Sith and unlike the Jedi, Tenebrous and Plagueis devoted much of their time to the study of midichlorians, which they saw as the source of the Force instead of its transmitters. Based on this unusual view of the Force, Tenebrous' version of the Sith Grand Plan was grounded primarily in conventional science. From his master, he had inherited the view that the Jedi didn't necessarily need to be slain, rather, the Sith could win by destroying the Jedi Order's place in the galaxy. But while Tenebrous' master aimed to achieve this by cutting the Jedi off from the Force, Tenebrous plotted to make the Jedi obsolete. His goal was to advance technology as much as possible, to design supercomputers and future-predicting algorithms that could perfectly distribute the galaxy's resource, eliminating scarcity and the everyday troubles of sentient beings. In a galaxy where everyone was protected and provided for, Tenebrous believed,
the Jedi Order would become redundant and die out, allowing the Sith to reign unopposed. To achieve his vision of the future, Tenebrous sought to meld technology and the dark side. Tenebrous, whose powers of precognition were even stronger than Yoda's, saw foresight as the primary purpose of the Force. Even the best computer models could be wrong, but if he created computers that, through the Force, could see the future clearly, then he'd have the building blocks of a perfectly planned economy. Unfortunately for Darth Tenebrous, his apprentice didn't share all of his views on the Force and the Sith grand plan. Tenebrous believed that the success of the plan was predetermined and inevitable. It could be predicted by the Sith, he argued, but they could do nothing to make it happen prematurely. Plagueis took a different approach. He didn't trust Tenebrous's visions, and unlike his master, he believed Sith victory could only be assured if the Jedi were completely wiped out. Sensing the growing alienation of his apprentice, Tenebrous secretly broke the rule of two near the end of his life. He took a second, secret apprentice, a fellow Bith whom he named Darth Venomous, who Plagueis later speculated to be a child of Tenebrous. Venomous was kept a closely guarded secret by Tenebrous, who saw his fellow Bith as a sort of backup plan. Tenebrous didn't live long enough to use that backup, however. In 67 BBY, during a mission gone awry on Baldemnik, Darth Plagueis took the opportunity to crush his master under a rock slide, killing him and usurping the title of Dark Lord. Plagueis then took the Sith Grand Plan in a different direction, taking Darth Sidious as his apprentice. But this wasn't the end of Darth Tenebrous. Tenebrous had a vision of his death before the trip to Baldemnik, and to prepare, he had infected some of his own midichlorians with a retrovirus, mutating them into a form he could control. When Tenebrous died, his midichlorians remained alive and, through the air, migrated into Plagueis' body. Thus, Tenebrous managed to live on, if only barely, a fragment of his consciousness enduring within his former apprentice. Soon after becoming Dark Lord, Plagueis encountered Darth Venomous, who he handily defeated. Venomous became Plagueis' lab rat. As he and Sidious developed methods of controlling midichlorians, Plagueis tested them on Venomous, killing and reviving the would-be Sith Lord dozens of times. All the while, that fragment of Tenebrous' consciousness bided its time. Tenebrous was waiting for the prophesized arrival of the Chosen One, which he could sense was near. When he got the opportunity, Tenebrous planned to transfer his essence to the Chosen One, stealing their body and cheating death in the process. But Darth Plagueis died too soon for Tenebrous' plan to come into fruition, murdered by his own apprentice. After Plagueis' death, Tenebrous' spirit was cut off from the Force due to the nature of his mutated midichlorians, but it was also unable to truly die. Darth Tenebrous was forced to relive his own death again and again, waiting for his midichlorians to finally perish and wishing that he still had a mouth with which to scream. So that was the rather unpleasant fates of Darth Tenebrous, a relatively peaceful Sith Lord. Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? I thought so. It's a story that most Star Wars fans have heard 1,000 times. But it paints a somewhat incomplete picture of Darth Plagueis. We all know of his ability to manipulate midichlorians, but relatively few Star Wars fans know about his unique takes on Sith ideology and the Force. Darth Plagueis didn't just want to control life and death or rule the galaxy, he also wanted to completely reinvent how the galaxy saw the Force. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the philosophy of Darth Plagueis and seeing if it holds any water. Born as Hago Damask, Darth Plagueis started life as a science experiment. His Mun parents had hooked up at the request of Dark Lord of the Sith Darth Tenebrous, who selected them for the express purpose of conceiving a child that would be extremely strong in the Force. Tenebrous' little experiment worked, and when young Hago Damask displayed signs of Force sensitivity, Tenebrous claimed him as his new Sith apprentice, naming him Darth Plagueis. Tenebrous, as we've discussed in the past, had his own unique outlook on the Force. A scientist by nature, Tenebrous believed that the best way to defeat Jedi was to make them obsolete by advancing technology to the point where neither the Force nor an order of peacekeepers were necessary. Plagueis ended up developing a much different grand plan and a different outlook on the Force, but traces of Tenebrous' philosophy lived on in his apprentices. In particular, Plagueis, like his master, was a committed scientist,
though in his day-to-day guise as Hege Damask, he posed as a banking executive instead. After becoming Dark Lord of the Sith and taking Darth Sidious as his apprentice, Plagueis started setting his own grand plan in motion, scheming to take over the Republic and engineer a war to destroy the Jedi and strengthen the Sith's political power base. But as time went on, Plagueis became fixated on other projects of his, leaving matters related to the grand plan to his apprentice. While Sidious laid the groundwork for the Sith's takeover of the galaxy, Plagueis cloistered himself in his laboratory on the remote moon of Sojourn, where he experimented on ways to control midichlorians. The goal of Plagueis' experiments was to fulfill the age-old desire of the Sith Lords to discover a means of achieving eternal life. He was eventually successful. Plagueis developed techniques to control midichlorians on a mass scale, enabling him to kill and resurrect beings through their midichlorians alone. He also developed ways of regenerating damaged or aged tissue in his own body, allowing him to live indefinitely. Of course, Darth Plagueis did not live indefinitely. In his arrogance, he failed to see that his apprentice was plotting against him, and when Plagueis got drunk and fell asleep while he and Sidious were celebrating the latter's ascension to Supreme Chancellery, Sidious murdered his master. Darth Plagueis' techniques to control midichlorians died with him, and no one, not even Darth Sidious, was ever able to replicate them. This was likely because Plagueis' techniques derived from a unique, staunchly materialist outlook on the Force. You see, Darth Plagueis was essentially an atheist. He believed that all the mystical characteristics usually attributed to the Force were all just superstitions built around a poorly understood, solely material phenomenon. Plagueis was convinced that, as the saying goes, magic's just science that we don't understand yet. To him, there was nothing supernatural about the Force. It was all either explainable by regular natural processes, or in the case of things like Force ghosts, was just superstition. He didn't believe in prophecies, the will of the Force, or any sort of Force-related afterlife, attributing both the Jedi's oneness with the Force and the Sith's experience of hell to spontaneous neural activity triggered by the onset of brain death. Plagueis also didn't believe in Force ghosts, a view he firmly maintained even after having an argument with the spectre of Marka Ragnos on Korriban. In other words, Plagueis was a materialist, or someone who believed that the observable, verifiable material world was all that existed. That wasn't a unique philosophical outlook in the Star Wars universe, but what made Plagueis different was how he incorporated the Force into it. It gave him an understanding of aspects of the Force that the Jedi and other Sith didn't have, stripping away philosophy and morality alike to lay bare physical and chemical reactions that other Force sensitives rarely considered. Where others saw mystical powers brought about through emotion or surrender to the Force, Plagueis saw transfers of momentum through midichlorians. Where others felt oneness with the universe through meditation and communion with the Force, Plagueis saw a euphoric reaction to the activation and nurturing of midichlorians. It all came down to the midichlorians for him, and that was why he was able to achieve what other Force users could not. To Plagueis, all those before him who attempted to achieve immortality through the Force failed because they had approached the matter through the lens of mysticism. On the flip side, he believed that all non-Force related attempts at immortality had failed because they didn't consider the Force and the role midichlorians played in the body. He saw life, like the Force itself, as a mere chemical reaction with no metaphysical significance, and he approached the issue of immortality by looking for ways to prolong that reaction indefinitely. He succeeded by finding ways to micromanage his own biological processes. We've been referring to this approach to the Force as a philosophy thus far, but that wasn't really accurate. Plagueis was essentially anti-philosophical. When it came to the Force, he saw no use in anything that wasn't purely scientific, and he eschewed any sort of mysticism, mortality, and ideology beyond the basic tenets of Sith belief. What ideology he had, he rationalized as being scientifically informed conclusions about the nature of the universe. Now to answer our main question, was Plagueis onto something? Obviously, his views weren't perfect at the very least. Some of what he rationalized as scientific conclusions were really just ideology, including pretty much everything that made him a Sith. Plagueis wholeheartedly believed he was better and more deserving than everyone else, and that colored his general outlook. It led him to the belief that the purpose of the weak was to serve the strong, for example. Obviously, We're not going to be giving those sorts of ideas any credence. It's the materialist approach to the Force we find interesting. Plagueis' outlook on the Force definitely allowed him to see and understand things that the Jedi and other Sith could not. At the end of the day, most of what we think about as the Force really was a set of physical reactions, and by examining the Force through that lens, Plagueis was able to achieve unprecedented levels of control over life and death. However, Plagueis was wrong in his belief that the Force was only a material phenomenon. His total denial of the metaphysical and philosophical sides of the Force were an error. Let's think back to Force ghosts, for example. As we mentioned earlier, Plagueis actually ran into a spirit on Korriban at one point, but he continued to deny the existence of Force ghosts after the fact, writing in his journal that he figured the whole thing was probably just an hallucination or something. This is an extraordinarily lame explanation, and it also doesn't hold up to scrutiny. As we can see from the events of the original trilogy, Force ghosts were not only undeniably real, but were also clearly the spirits of individuals they appeared as. They weren't hallucinations, they weren't imposters, and in the Star Wars universe, they were verifiable proof of life after death. Plagueis' ideology had no answer for phenomena like this. All Plagueis could really do was weakly deny they existed. His view of life and consciousness as solely chemical processes with no metaphysical significance kind of falls apart when confronted with consciousness persisting after the death and destruction of their bodies. Plagueis understood aspects of the Force better than anyone else, but he failed to understand the whole of the Force, especially its will. So, did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Not-So-Wise after all? I thought so. It's the story we just told you. Now it's your turn to tell stories we wouldn't hear from the Jedi. What do you think of Plagueis' view of the Force? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section down below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.